Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness surrounding Moosehead Lake in Maine, during what was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip with my two closest friends from college. The three of us, myself, Jake Morrison, and Tom Bradley, had been planning this trip for months. We were all desk jockeys now, software engineers who spent our days hunched over computers in Portland's tech district, and we desperately needed to reconnect with something real, something wild. Jake had discovered this supposedly pristine camping spot near Lily Bay State Park, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound deep into the 100-mile wilderness. No cell towers, no tourists, no civilization for miles in any direction. Perfect for getting our heads straight, Jake had said, his enthusiasm infectious despite the dark circles under his eyes. He'd been struggling since his divorce 6 months prior, throwing himself into work with an intensity that worried Tom and me. This trip was as much intervention as adventure. Tom, ever the pragmatist, had insisted on bringing enough supplies for a week, even though we'd only planned to stay 3 days. Better safe than sorry in the Maine woods, he'd said, loading his oversized pack with enough MREs, water purification tablets, and emergency gear to stock a small survivalist bunker. At 28, he was the youngest of us, but by far the most cautious, a trait that had saved our asses more than once during our college hiking adventures. The drive up from Portland took 4 hours, winding through increasingly remote terrain until we reached the dirt access road Jake had found on some obscure camping forum. The road was barely wide enough for my Subaru, and after 20 minutes of careful navigation around potholes and fallen branches, we reached the coordinates Jake had marked on his GPS. The spot was everything he'd promised. A small clearing nestled between towering pines and ancient oaks, with Moosehead Lake visible through gaps in the tree line. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the late afternoon sky like polished obsidian. Complete silence surrounded us. No distant highway noise, no aircraft overhead, just the whisper of wind through the canopy and the occasional lap of tiny waves against the distant shore. "This is incredible," I breathed, stepping out of the car and stretching muscles cramped from the long drive. The air was crisp and clean, carrying scents of pine sap, damp earth, and something else, something faintly metallic that I couldn't quite identify. We set up camp with practiced efficiency, our old college routine falling back into place as if we'd done this just last weekend instead of 5 years ago. Jake seemed more relaxed than I'd seen him in months, his usual manic energy replaced by something approaching peace as he arranged stones for our fire ring. Tom methodically organized our supplies while I pitched our 3 tents in a triangle around the fire pit. As dusk settled over the lake, we built a fire and opened our first beers, settling into our folding chairs with satisfied sighs. The flames danced hypnotically, casting shifting shadows that seemed to make the surrounding forest pulse and breathe. "To getting the hell away from everything," Jake toasted, raising his bottle. "To old friends," Tom added. "To not checking email for 3 whole days," I finished, and we drank. The first night passed without incident, though I remember waking several times to sounds I couldn't quite identify. Soft rustling that seemed too deliberate to be wind, and once, what might have been footsteps circling our camp. Each time I peered out of my tent, I saw nothing but darkness and the dying embers of our fire. Morning brought relief and embarrassment at my night fears. The forest was beautiful in daylight, dappled with golden sunbeams that made the previous night's anxieties seem foolish. We cooked breakfast over the rekindled fire, bacon and eggs that tasted better than any restaurant meal, and planned our day. "There's supposed to be a great hiking trail about 2 miles north," Jake said, consulting his printed map. "Leads to some waterfalls that aren't on any official park guides." Tom looked skeptical. "Are we sure we want to go off the beaten path on our first day? Maybe we should stick closer to camp." "Come on, Tommy," Jake cajoled. "Where's your sense of adventure? We came here to get away from the safe, predictable world, remember?" I found myself agreeing with Jake, though something nagged at me about the idea. The forest felt different in daylight, still beautiful, but somehow watching, alert, as if we were the subject of invisible scrutiny. We packed day packs with water, snacks, and basic supplies, then set off through the woods following Jake's hand-drawn directions. The terrain was rougher than expected, with no clear trail visible despite Jake's assurances. We bushwhacked through dense underbrush, following what might have been game trails or might have been our own wishful thinking. After an hour of difficult hiking, Tom stopped abruptly. "Guys, look at this." He was pointing at a tree about 20 feet ahead, a massive oak that must have been centuries old. Carved into its bark, at roughly eye level, were symbols I didn't recognize. Not letters or numbers, but angular marks that seemed to form some kind of pattern. They were old, the bark having grown partially over them, but still clearly visible. "What do you think that means?" Jake asked, approaching for a closer look. "Probably just some hunter's markers," I said, though the symbols made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't explain. They seemed to shift slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them, like optical illusions that played tricks on peripheral vision. Tom ran his fingers over the carved marks, frowning. "These are really old, and they don't look like any hunting signs I've ever seen." As we stood examining the tree, I became aware of a change in the forest around us. The normal sounds, birdsong, insect buzzing, rustling leaves, had gradually faded to complete silence. Even our own voices seemed muffled, as if the air itself had grown thick and oppressive. "Is it just me, or did it get really quiet all of a sudden?" I asked. Jake and Tom looked around, finally noticing what I'd just realized. The forest had become utterly still, as if every living thing had simultaneously decided to hold its breath. "That's weird," Tom said softly. Then we heard it, a sound that made my blood freeze. It started as a low moan, almost human but not quite, echoing from somewhere deeper in the forest. The sound rose and fell like a lament, filled with such profound despair that it seemed to reach into my chest and squeeze my heart. "What the hell was that?" Jake whispered. The sound came again, closer this time, and definitely moving in our direction. It was joined by another noise, the crack and snap of branches being broken by something large pushing through the underbrush. "We should go back," Tom said, already turning toward the way we'd come, but when we looked behind us, the familiar landmarks were gone. The terrain looked completely different than what we'd just hiked through, as if the forest had rearranged itself while we weren't paying attention. "Which way did we come from?" Jake asked, his voice tight with the first edge of panic. I pulled out my phone to check the GPS, but the screen showed no signal and no location data. The compass app spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. The moaning sound came again, much closer now, accompanied by what sounded like heavy breathing, or panting. Through the trees, I caught a glimpse of movement, something pale and impossibly tall shambling between the trunks about 50 yards away. "Move," I said. "Now!" We crashed through the forest in what I hoped was the direction of our camp, branches whipping at our faces and roots catching our feet. Behind us, the thing in the woods was definitely following. I could hear it breaking through the underbrush, moving with a lurching, uneven gait that somehow kept pace with our desperate flight. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, we stumbled into our camp clearing, gasping and wild-eyed. Our tents stood exactly as we'd left them, the cold fire ring surrounded by our scattered camping chairs. Normal, safe, real. "What the fuck was that?" Jake panted, hands on his knees. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I saw something. Something big." Tom was already checking his pack for our emergency supplies. "Maybe we should consider cutting the trip short. Head back to Portland tonight." "No way," Jake said, straightening up. "We're not going to let some weird forest sound scare us away from the first real break we've had in years. It was probably just a moose or something. They can sound pretty strange during mating season. I wanted to argue, but Jake's reasoning made sense. In daylight, surrounded by our familiar camping gear, the morning's experience seemed less terrifying and more like the result of overactive imaginations and too many horror movies. We spent the rest of the day close to camp, swimming in the lake and lounging in the sun. The water was incredibly clear but surprisingly cold, even in the shallows. As I floated on my back, looking up at the pristine blue sky, I noticed something odd about the lake. Despite its size, Moosehead Lake was one of Maine's largest. I couldn't see any other campers, boats, or signs of human activity anywhere on its surface. We seemed to be completely alone in a wilderness that stretched unbroken to every horizon. That evening, as we sat around our rebuilt fire, the forest began its nightly symphony of sounds. But something was different from the previous night. The normal chorus of crickets, owls, and small nocturnal animals was absent. Instead, we heard only that same low moaning we'd encountered during our hike, now coming from multiple directions around our camp. "There's more than one of them," Tom said quietly, unconsciously moving his chair closer to the fire. The sounds continued throughout the evening, mournful wails that seemed to circle our camp at a respectful distance, never approaching close enough for us to see their source. Sometimes they sounded almost human, like people in terrible distress calling for help. Other times they were definitely something else entirely. "We should take shifts keeping watch," I suggested as we prepared for bed. "Watch for what?" Jake asked, though his earlier bravado had faded considerably. "I don't know. Just watch." We agreed on 2-hour shifts, with Tom taking first watch from 10 until midnight. I tried to sleep, but found myself lying awake in my tent, listening to the strange sounds outside and the soft murmur of Tom talking to himself to stay alert. Around 11:30, Tom's voice stopped. I waited a few minutes, then called softly, "Tom, you okay out there?" No response. I unzipped my tent and peered out at the fire. Tom's chair was empty, his flashlight lying on the ground beside it. The fire was burning normally, but Tom was nowhere to be seen. "Jake," I hissed, shaking his tent. "Jake, wake up! Tom's gone." Jake emerged from his tent, immediately alert. "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" "He was on watch duty, and now he's not here. His flashlight's on the ground." We searched the immediate area around camp, calling Tom's name in urgent whispers. His sleeping bag was still in his tent, his pack was still by the fire, but Tom himself had vanished without a trace. "Maybe he went to take a leak," Jake suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. We waited by the fire, straining our ears for any sound of Tom's return. Minutes stretched into an hour. The moaning sounds from the forest had stopped, leaving us in silence so complete it felt oppressive. Then we heard Tom's voice calling from the woods. "Mike! Jake! Help me!" The voice came from the north, somewhere beyond the tree line. It sounded like Tom, but something was off about it. The pitch was slightly wrong, and there was an odd echo quality, as if it were coming from a great distance or from inside a cave. "Tom!" Jake called back. "Where are you?" "I'm lost," came the reply. "I can't find my way back to camp. Help me." Jake started toward the voice, but I grabbed his arm. "Wait, something's not right." "What do you mean?" "That's Tom. He needs help." "Listen to the voice. Really listen." Jake paused, head cocked toward the sound. Tom's voice came again. "Please, I'm hurt. I need help." This time, Jake heard it too. The way the words seemed to be spoken without any emotion, like someone reading lines from a script. The voice was Tom's, but the inflection was all wrong. "That's not Tom," Jake whispered. As if in response to his words, the voice changed slightly, still recognizably Tom's voice, but now with a mocking quality. "Come find me, Mike. Come find me, Jake. Come play with me in the dark." We backed toward the fire, every instinct screaming danger. The voice continued calling, sometimes pleading, sometimes laughing, always with that wrong, empty quality that made my skin crawl. "We need to get out of here," I said. "Now." But when we looked toward where we'd parked my car, it wasn't there. The small clearing where I'd carefully parked the Subaru the previous afternoon was empty except for some scattered pine needles. "Where's your car?" Jake asked, his voice cracking with panic. I stared at the empty space, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. It was right there. I parked it right there. We searched the entire camp area, using our flashlights to examine every possible spot where I might have misremembered parking. But the car was simply gone, as completely as if it had never existed. Tom's voice continued calling from the woods, now joined by what sounded like my own voice and Jake's, all three calling to each other in various combinations and distortions. The sounds seemed to be coming from all around us now, moving through the forest in impossible patterns. "This isn't real," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This can't be real." But it was real, and it was getting worse. As the night wore on, the voices multiplied and began saying things that made no sense. Personal memories spoken in our own voices, conversations we'd never had, confessions of secrets we'd never shared. Around 3 a.m, the real Tom stumbled back into our camp. He emerged from the tree line like a sleepwalker, moving with slow, deliberate steps that seemed somehow wrong. His clothes were dirty and torn, his face was pale, and his eyes reflected our flashlight beams like an animal's. "Tom?" I called softly. "Are you okay?" He turned toward my voice, and when he smiled, I felt my blood turn to ice. The smile was too wide, stretching his mouth in a way that looked painful. His teeth appeared to be stained dark, though it was hard to tell in the firelight. "I'm fine," he said, and his voice was perfectly normal. "Just got a little lost, that's all." He walked to his chair and sat down as if nothing had happened, still wearing that horrible smile. Jake and I exchanged glances, both of us recognizing that something was fundamentally wrong with our friend. "Tom," Jake said carefully, "where did you go? We heard you calling for help." "Calling for help?" Tom tilted his head at an unnatural angle. "I don't remember calling for help. I was just exploring. For 4 hours? Has it been 4 hours?" Tom's smile never wavered. "Time moves differently here. You'll understand soon." I noticed he wasn't blinking. At all. He just sat there, smiling that terrible smile, staring at us with unblinking eyes that reflected the firelight like mirrors. "Tom, you're scaring us," I said. "What happened to you out there?" "Nothing happened to me." His voice remained perfectly calm, perfectly normal, and that somehow made it more terrifying than any screaming would have been. "I met some new friends. They're very eager to meet you too." The temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees in an instant. Our breath began to fog, and the fire flickered as if struggling against a sudden wind, though I felt no breeze. "They're hungry," Tom continued conversationally. "They've been hungry for so long, but you're here now, so everything will be fine." Jake stood up abruptly. "That's it. We're leaving. Right now." "How?" Tom asked and laughed. The sound was nothing like Tom's normal laugh. It was high-pitched and went on too long, like a broken record stuck on repeat. "Your car drove away hours ago. Didn't you see it leave?" As he spoke, I realized he was right. I had seen the car leaving, or thought I had. Around midnight, just before Tom disappeared, I'd glimpsed headlights moving away through the trees. At the time, I'd assumed it was my imagination, or maybe another camper. But now, I remembered the sound of my Subaru's specific engine note fading into the distance. "Something moved our car," I said slowly. "Something had to," Tom agreed, still smiling. "It was in the way." Jake grabbed a burning branch from the fire, holding it like a torch. "Stay back, Tom. I don't know what's wrong with you, but stay back." Tom laughed again, that horrible broken record sound that seemed to echo from multiple directions at once. "Oh, Jake, you always were the smartest one, but it's too late to be smart now." As he spoke, shapes began emerging from the forest around our camp. At first, they looked like trees moving in the wind, but as they drew closer, I realized they were figures. Impossibly tall, impossibly thin, moving with that same lurching gait we'd heard during our panicked flight earlier in the day. There were 5 of them, and they moved to surround our camp in a loose circle. In the firelight, I could make out details that my mind struggled to process. They might have been human once, but they were stretched and elongated like taffy pulled by a cruel child. Their limbs were too long, their torsos too narrow, their heads slightly too large for their emaciated bodies, but their faces were the worst part. Each one wore the face of someone I recognized: my college roommate, my first girlfriend, my father, my brother. Perfect replicas, but worn by creatures that were definitely not human. "Don't look at their faces," I warned Jake, remembering half-forgotten folklore about creatures that stole the appearance of people you knew. "Too late for that, too," Tom said pleasantly. He stood up from his chair, and as he did, his body began to stretch and elongate just like the others. His arms grew longer, his torso narrowed, his legs extended until he towered over us by several feet. But his face remained perfectly, horribly normal. "Run," I whispered to Jake. We bolted from the camp, crashing through the underbrush in blind panic. Behind us, that broken record laughter multiplied into a hideous chorus as the creatures gave chase. They moved through the forest with impossible speed, their elongated limbs allowing them to cover ground in great bounding strides that easily kept pace with our desperate flight. Branches whipped at our faces, roots caught our feet, and thorns tore at our clothes as we ran through the dark forest. My lungs burned and my legs cramped, but the sounds of pursuit never faded. If anything, they seemed to be getting closer. After what felt like hours of running, we stumbled onto what looked like a trail, just a narrow dirt path winding between the trees, but it was the first sign of human presence we'd seen since our car disappeared. "Which way?" Jake gasped. Before I could answer, we heard voices ahead of us on the trail. Human voices, speaking in normal tones, getting closer. Relief flooded through me as I realized we weren't alone in this nightmare. But as the voices drew nearer, I began to make out words, and the relief turned to fresh horror. The voices were our own, mine and Jake's, having a conversation about how we needed to get back to camp to help Tom. "That's us," Jake whispered. "But we're right here." The fake versions of ourselves appeared around a bend in the trail, walking casually as if they were just out for an evening stroll. They looked exactly like us, down to the torn clothing and dirt from our panicked flight through the forest. When they saw us, they stopped and smiled. "There you are," the fake version of me said. "We've been looking for you. Tom's worried." "Come back to camp," the fake Jake added. "Everything's going to be fine." "You're not us," Jake said, raising his makeshift torch. "Of course we are," fake Jake replied. "Don't you recognize yourselves?" More creatures emerged from the forest, dozens of them now, all wearing familiar faces. Some I recognized immediately, others took a moment to place. Teachers from elementary school, distant relatives, casual acquaintances from work. All stretched and distorted, but all unmistakably real people I had known. "What do you want?" I demanded. "To feed," said a creature wearing my mother's face. "We've been so hungry for so long." "And to play," added another with the face of my high school girlfriend. "It gets so lonely here." They began to close in around us, moving with that same lurching gait. Jake swung his torch at the nearest one and it recoiled with a shriek that sounded like tearing metal. The flames seemed to hurt it, or at least hold it at bay. "The fire," I said. "They don't like fire." We broke branches from nearby trees and lit them from Jake's torch, creating our own small circle of flame. The creatures stopped their advance, but they didn't retreat. They just stood there, wearing the faces of people we'd known, waiting. "This isn't sustainable," Jake said. "These branches won't burn forever." He was right. We needed a real plan, not just a temporary reprieve. But as I looked around at the ring of creatures surrounding us, I noticed something important. They were avoiding the trail itself, staying just inside the tree line. "The path," I said. "Look at their feet. They won't step on the path." Jake looked where I was pointing and saw what I'd noticed. Despite having us surrounded, all of the creatures were carefully avoiding the narrow dirt trail, as if there were an invisible barrier keeping them from stepping onto it. "Some kind of protection," Jake murmured, "like folklore stuff. Evil spirits can't cross running water or blessed ground." "Or marked trails," I added, remembering the carved symbols we'd seen on the tree earlier. Maybe this trail was marked by whoever carved those symbols. We began moving down the path, keeping our torches ready. The creatures followed us on either side, staying parallel but never crossing onto the trail itself. Their eyes reflected our firelight as they paced us through the forest, patient as predators following wounded prey. The trail wound through the forest for what felt like miles, sometimes climbing over rocky outcrops, sometimes descending into small valleys thick with mist. Our makeshift torches burned down to stubs, and we had to keep lighting new ones from the dying flames of the old. Dawn was beginning to show as gray light filtering through the canopy when we finally saw it, a small cabin set in a clearing just off the trail. Smoke rose from its chimney, and warm yellow light glowed in its windows. "Thank God," Jake breathed. "Civilization." But as we approached the cabin, I noticed something that made me hesitate. The structure looked old, not just weathered, but genuinely ancient. The logs were gray with age, and the chinking between them was packed with moss and mud in a way that spoke of decades without maintenance. More importantly, the creatures that had been following us had vanished the moment we'd come within sight of the cabin. The forest around us was empty and silent, as if they had never been there at all. "I don't like this," I said. "It's shelter," Jake replied, "and there's someone inside. Look at the smoke." He was right about the fire, and after our night of terror, the promise of warmth and human contact was too tempting to resist. We approached the cabin and knocked on the heavy wooden door. "Come in," called a voice from inside. "The door's not locked." We entered to find a single room dominated by a massive stone fireplace where a cheerful fire crackled and popped. The space was furnished with handmade furniture that looked as old as the cabin itself. Rough wooden chairs, a table made from a single enormous tree slab, shelves lined with mason jars containing various preserved foods. An elderly woman sat in a rocking chair beside the fire, working on what appeared to be a patchwork quilt. She looked up as we entered, and her weathered face creased into a welcoming smile. "Well now," she said, "you boys look like you've had quite a night. Come sit by the fire and warm yourselves." She appeared to be in her 70s, with gray hair pulled back in a simple bun, and clothes that looked like they'd been sewn from homespun cloth decades earlier. Everything about her radiated the kind of calm competence that spoke of a lifetime spent living close to the land. "Thank you," I said, settling gratefully into one of the wooden chairs. The warmth from the fire felt incredible after our cold night of terror. "We got lost camping and ran into some trouble." "I imagine you did," she said, not looking up from her sewing. "The woods around here can be dangerous for folks who don't know their way." "Have you lived here long?" Jake asked. "Oh, my whole life," she replied. "Born in this cabin, expect to die in it too. My family's been taking care of these woods for more generations than I can count." "Taking care of them how?" She set down her quilting and looked at us with eyes that were sharper than her grandmotherly appearance had initially suggested. "Keeping the old things contained, making sure they don't spread beyond where they belong." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold morning air. "Old things?" "The Wendigo," she said simply. "Though that's not really what they are. That's just the closest word we have for them in English. They're older than any human language, older than humans themselves." She stood up and moved to her kitchen area, starting to prepare what smelled like coffee on an ancient wood stove. They feed on human flesh. But more than that, they feed on human connection. They steal faces, voices, memories, use them to lure more prey. "The things that were chasing us," Jake said, "they looked like people we knew." "Course they did. That's how they hunt. Show you what you want to see, make you trust them long enough to get close." She poured coffee into 2 ceramic mugs and handed them to us. The liquid was strong and bitter, but wonderfully warm. "Our friend Tom," I said. "Something happened to him. He came back to camp, but he wasn't himself." The old woman nodded sadly. "They got to him first. Probably been planning it for a while. They're smart, these creatures. Smarter than most people give them credit for." "Is he dead?" "Not exactly. They don't kill quickly. They hollow you out from the inside, wear you like a costume until there's nothing left of the original person. Takes days, sometimes weeks." I thought about Tom's horrible smile, his unblinking eyes, his too calm voice discussing hunger and new friends. Can he be saved? She was quiet for a long moment, sipping her coffee and staring into the fire. "Maybe," she said finally, "if you got to him quick enough, if there's still enough of him left inside that thing wearing his face." "How?" "Fire," she said simply. "Clean, hot fire. It's the only thing they truly fear, the only thing that can force them to release their hold on someone." "You mean burn him?" "The creature, not your friend. The thing that's wearing him like a suit. Fire forces them to abandon their stolen forms, and sometimes, if you're lucky and quick, you can pull the original person back before they're completely consumed." She finished her coffee and set the mug aside. "But it's dangerous, more dangerous than anything you faced last night. If there's not enough of your friend left, or if you hesitate even for a second, it'll be you wearing someone else's face by morning." Jake and I looked at each other. The smart thing would be to thank this woman for her help and ask her to guide us back to civilization. We could report Tom missing to the authorities and let trained professionals handle whatever was happening in these woods. But I kept thinking about Tom's horrible smile, and about how he'd looked at us with those dead, reflective eyes. Whatever was wearing his face wasn't him anymore, but what if some part of him was still trapped inside, aware of what was being done to his body? "How do we find him?" I asked. The old woman smiled grimly. "Oh, that's the easy part. They'll come to you, probably already on their way. They don't like losing prey, and they especially don't like prey that escapes to tell tales." As if summoned by her words, we heard Tom's voice calling from outside the cabin. "Mike, Jake, where are you? I've been looking everywhere." The voice sounded perfectly normal now. Worried, tired, completely human. If I hadn't seen what Tom had become the night before, I would have rushed outside to help him. "That's not him," Jake said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The old woman went to one of her shelves and began pulling down various jars and bundles of dried herbs. "Doesn't matter if it's him or not," she said pragmatically. "Either way, you've got work to do." She mixed various substances in a small clay bowl: salt, what looked like dried sage, some kind of powdered root I didn't recognize, and several other ingredients. When she was finished, she handed the bowl to me. "Throw this mixture into any fire near the creature," she instructed. "It'll burn hot and bright, and the smoke will force the Wendigo to show its true form. That's when you'll know if there's anything left of your friend to save." Tom's voice came again, closer now. "Please, guys, I'm hurt. I need help." "What if there is something left of him?" Jake asked. "Then you get him away from the fire as quickly as possible and bring him back here," she said. "I've got medicines that might help, ways to strengthen what's left of his true self." "And if there isn't?" Her expression grew grim. "Then you make sure that thing can never wear another face again." Tom's voice was right outside the cabin now, pleading and desperate. "I can see the light from your fire. I know you're in there. Why won't you help me?" The old woman handed Jake a bundle of what looked like wooden stakes, each one carved with symbols similar to those we'd seen on the tree. "Just in case," she said. She opened the cabin door and called out, "Tom Bradley, is that really you out there?" There was a pause, then Tom's voice replied, "Of course it's me. Who else would it be?" "Then you won't mind proving it," she said. "Step into the light where we can see you." Another pause, longer this time. When Tom's voice came again, it had lost some of its human warmth. "I don't need to prove anything. These are my friends." Real friends don't hide in the shadows," the old woman replied calmly. A sound like tearing fabric came from the darkness outside, followed by a low moan that made my teeth ache. When Tom's voice spoke again, it was layered with harmonics that no human throat could produce. "Let us in, old woman. You've meddled enough." "Not likely," she replied and slammed the door shut. She quickly began nailing iron spikes into the frame, spikes that had obviously been prepared for exactly this purpose. "They can't enter without permission," she explained as she worked. "Old rules, older than Christianity. But they can make things mighty unpleasant for folks inside." As if to prove her point, the cabin began to shake. Not like an earthquake, more like something enormous was circling it, brushing against the walls as it passed. The windows rattled and dust rained down from the rafters. "How long will this last?" I asked. "Until dawn," she said. "They're strongest in the deep dark, but daylight weakens them considerably." The shaking continued for hours, accompanied by sounds that seemed designed to drive us insane. Voices of people we knew calling for help, scraping noises like claws on wood, and underneath it all, that horrible broken record laughter we'd heard from the thing wearing Tom's face. But, as the old woman had promised, everything stopped when the first rays of sunlight penetrated the forest canopy. The sudden silence was almost as unsettling as the night's torment had been. "Now's your chance," she said, unbarring the door. "They'll be weaker in daylight, but they won't be gone. You'll have maybe 6 hours before they're back to full strength." Jake and I looked at each other one more time. This was our last chance to walk away, to choose safety over friendship. But we both knew what we had to do. "How do we find our camp?" I asked. "Follow the trail back the way you came," she said. "But be careful. They'll try to confuse you, make you think you're lost. Trust the marked path and don't listen to any voices you might hear calling from the woods." She pressed the clay bowl of herbs into my hands and gave Jake additional stakes and a small hatchet that looked like it had seen considerable use. "Remember," she said, "fire first. If there's anything left of your friend, the flames will force the creature to release him. But if there isn't—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. The journey back to our camp took most of the morning. True to the old woman's warning, we heard voices constantly calling from the forest. Sometimes Tom, sometimes people we knew, sometimes strangers offering help or directions. But we stuck to the marked trail and ignored them all. Our camp looked exactly as we'd left it. 3 tents arranged around a cold fire pit, our supplies scattered where we'd dropped them in panic. Everything normal and peaceful in the morning sunlight, except for the complete absence of any wildlife sounds. "Where is he?" Jake whispered. As if in answer to his question, Tom emerged from his tent, stretching and yawning as if he'd just woken from a peaceful night's sleep. In the daylight, he looked completely normal. No elongated limbs, no horrible smile, just our friend Tom looking slightly confused and concerned. "There you guys are," he said, relief evident in his voice. "I woke up and you were gone. I was starting to worry something had happened to you." For a moment, I almost believed it. He sounded so much like the real Tom that I wanted to drop the bowl of herbs and apologize for doubting him. But then I noticed his eyes. They still had that reflective quality, like mirrors catching light, and he still wasn't blinking. "Tom," I said carefully, "do you remember what happened last night?" "Last night?" He looked genuinely puzzled. "We sat around the fire, had a few beers, went to bed. Why? Did something happen?" "You disappeared," Jake said, his hand tightening on the hatchet. "You were supposed to be keeping watch, but when Mike checked on you, you were gone." Tom's expression grew concerned. "I don't remember that at all. Maybe I sleepwalked. I've been doing that sometimes since the divorce. Stress. You know." It was a perfectly reasonable explanation, and delivered with exactly the kind of embarrassed honesty the real Tom would have shown. If not for those terrible, unblinking eyes, I might have convinced myself that everything we'd experienced was some kind of shared nightmare. "Tom," I said, "I need you to look at me and blink." "What? Why would—" He started to respond normally, then stopped. His head tilted at that unnatural angle we'd seen the night before, and when he smiled, it was that horrible too-wide grin that stretched his mouth like rubber. "Oh," he said, and his voice carried multiple harmonics now. "You figured it out." The thing wearing Tom's face began to change, its body elongating and stretching just as it had in the darkness. But in daylight, the transformation was even more horrifying because I could see every detail. Tom's skin grew pale and translucent, revealing dark veins beneath. His limbs extended like taffy being pulled, bones cracking and reforming with sounds that made me gag. His face remained Tom's, but it began to slip and slide like a badly fitted mask. "Where is he?" I demanded, pulling out the old woman's herb mixture. "Where's the real Tom?" "Here," the creature said, its voice now clearly not human. "He's here, watching everything I do with his body. He can see you, he can hear you, but he can't speak, can't move, can't do anything but experience what I experience." It laughed with that broken record sound that seemed to come from several throats at once. "He's been begging me to stop, but he's getting weaker. Soon, there won't be anything left but me wearing his memories." Jake stepped forward with the hatchet raised, but the creature was faster. One impossibly long arm swept out and knocked him backward into our cold fire pit. He hit the ground hard and didn't get up immediately. "Jake!" I shouted, but I couldn't help him. The creature was advancing on me now, moving with that lurching, predatory gait. I fumbled with a lighter, trying to get our old fire started so I could throw the herbs into it. But my hands were shaking, and the lighter kept slipping from my fingers. "There's no hurry," the creature said, looming over me. "We have all day, and when night falls there will be two of me. Won't that be fun?" It reached for me with hands that had grown too many joints, fingers that bent in directions fingers shouldn't bend. I could see Tom's face still stretched over its skull like a rubber mask, his eyes wide with terror and pleading. The lighter finally caught, and I managed to get some kindling burning in the fire pit. The moment the first flames appeared, the creature recoiled with a shriek, just as the old woman had predicted. I threw the herb mixture into the small fire, and it immediately blazed up in a column of brilliant white flame that reached nearly to the tree canopy. The smoke was thick and pungent, carrying scents of sage and sulfur and something else that burned my nostrils. The creature screamed, a sound like metal tearing that seemed to come from every direction at once. Its stolen body began to convulse, the elongated limbs thrashing wildly as if it were fighting against invisible restraints. Tom's face, still stretched over the creature's skull, began to change. The horrible smile faded, replaced by an expression of confused terror that was heartbreakingly familiar. "Mike?" Tom's voice, weak but undeniably real. "Help me. I can't move my body." "Fight it, Tom," I shouted over the creature's screams. "You're stronger than it is." The battle between Tom's consciousness and the creature possessing him played out in his body language. Sometimes he would take a step toward me, his face showing desperate hope. Then the creature would reassert control, and he would lurch backward, his features twisting into that terrible predatory grin. Jake had recovered enough to get back to his feet, blood running from a cut on his forehead where he'd hit the ground. "The fire's not big enough," he shouted. "We need more fuel." He began throwing everything burnable he could find into the flames. Our camping chairs, dried pine needles, pieces of our torn clothing. The fire roared higher, and the herb smoke grew thicker. The creature possessing Tom was weakening visibly. Its elongated limbs were shortening, returning closer to normal human proportions. Tom's face was becoming more stable, less like a mask and more like his actual features. "It's working!" I yelled. "Keep feeding the fire." But as Jake reached for more fuel, something emerged from the forest behind him. Another creature, this one wearing the face of our old college friend Danny Morrison, a face I hadn't seen in years, which meant the creature had been watching us much longer than we'd realized. "Jake, behind you," I warned. Jake spun around just as the Danny creature reached for him with those horrible elongated fingers. He swung the hatchet in a wide arc and the blade bit deep into the creature's arm. Black ichor spurted from the wound, and the thing let out a shriek that harmonized with the sounds coming from the Tom creature. More shapes were emerging from the tree line, a whole pack of the creatures, each wearing the face of someone we knew. They moved cautiously, clearly afraid of the fire but drawn by the distress of their pack member. "There are too many of them," Jake said, backing toward the fire pit. The Tom creature was still convulsing in the smoke, its screams growing weaker but more human. I could see Tom's consciousness fighting its way back to the surface, but the process was agonizingly slow. "Tom," I called to him, "you have to fight harder. Use your memories. Remember who you are." His face, now almost completely back to normal proportions, turned toward me with desperate effort. "The divorce," he said, his voice barely audible over the crackling flames. "Sarah left because I worked too much, because I never made time for what mattered." "That's right," I encouraged him. "What else? What makes you Tom Bradley?" I used to build model airplanes when I was a kid. My dad taught me. We'd spend hours in the basement, just the two of us." With each memory he spoke, his body seemed to become more solid, more real. The other creatures were circling closer, but they seemed hesitant to approach while Tom was fighting back so successfully. Maybe they were afraid the same thing could happen to them, that the flames and smoke could force them to disgorge their own stolen identities. "Keep going, Tom," Jake urged, swinging his hatchet to keep the nearest creature at bay. "What's your favorite movie?" "The Princess Bride," Tom said, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he smiled. A real smile, not the horrible rictus grin of the creature. "I can quote the whole thing. Hello, my name is Inigo Montoya." As he spoke the familiar line, something seemed to snap back into place inside him. The unnatural flexibility left his limbs, his skin regained its normal color, and, most importantly, he blinked. Several times in rapid succession as if making up for lost time. "I'm back," he said, wonder evident in his voice. "Jesus Christ, I'm back." But we weren't safe yet. The other creatures, seeing that their pack member had been successfully extracted from his stolen form, began rushing toward us with renewed aggression. They seemed to realize that the fire was a genuine threat to their existence. "Can you move?" I asked Tom. He tested his limbs experimentally. "Yeah, I think so. God, the things I remember. The things it made me do." He shuddered. "Tell us later," Jake said, bringing down his hatchet on another reaching arm. "Right now, we need to get out of here." But there were too many of them, and they were closing in from all sides. Even with the fire at our backs, we were outnumbered at least 10 to 1. That's when I remembered the wooden stakes the old woman had given Jake. They were carved with the same symbols we'd seen on the tree, the same protective markings that had kept the creatures off the trail. "The stakes!" I shouted to Jake. "Throw me one of those stakes." He tossed one to me without questioning why. The moment my hand closed around the carved wood, I felt a strange tingling sensation, as if the symbols were warm to the touch. I held the stake up between us and the nearest creature, and it recoiled as if I'd pointed a loaded gun at it. The carved symbols seemed to glow faintly in the firelight, and the creature wearing Danny's face backed away with a low whine. "They work," I said, amazed. "The symbols actually work." Jake pulled out another stake, and Tom grabbed the third one from where it had fallen during the fight. Armed with the protective totems, we were able to create a small bubble of safety around the fire pit. But it was only a temporary reprieve. The creatures circled us like wolves, just out of range of the stakes but clearly waiting for an opportunity. And our fire was starting to burn down. We'd used most of our available fuel to create the blaze that had freed Tom from his possessor. "We need to make a run for the trail," I said. "It's the only place we'll be safe." "Which direction?" Tom asked. His memory of the area seemed to be intact, but after everything he'd been through, I didn't trust his sense of direction. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the path we'd taken from the old woman's cabin. North, I thought. The trail should be roughly north of our camp. "That way," I said, pointing toward what felt like the right direction. We formed a tight triangle, each of us holding one of the protective stakes, and began moving away from the fire. The creatures followed us, maintaining their distance but never letting us out of sight. The forest seemed different in daylight than it had during our panicked flight the night before. The trees were more widely spaced, and I could make out what might have been a path winding between them. But every time I thought I'd spotted the trail, it seemed to shift and fade when I looked directly at it. "I don't think this is right," Jake said after we'd been walking for about 10 minutes. "The terrain feels wrong." He was right. We should have reached the trail by now, or at least found some familiar landmark. Instead, we seemed to be moving deeper into unfamiliar forest, with the creatures following patiently behind us. "They're herding us," Tom realized, "driving us away from the trail on purpose." The creatures had spread out into a wide arc behind us, and every time we tried to change direction, they would move to block our path. We were being guided towards something, but I had no idea what. After another 20 minutes of walking, we emerged into a clearing I'd never seen before. It was roughly circular, perhaps 50 feet across, and the ground was covered with symbols carved directly into the earth. The same angular markings we'd seen on the tree, but hundreds of them, forming complex patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed peripherally. In the center of the clearing stood a structure that made my blood freeze. It looked like an altar, a flat stone slab raised on carved pillars, and it was stained dark with substances I didn't want to identify. "This is where they bring their prey," Tom said quietly. "I remember now. It tried to bring me here last night, but something stopped it. The old woman's protections, I guessed. The trail, the marked trees. She's been keeping them contained in this area." The creatures had formed a complete circle around the clearing now, but they still wouldn't enter the space marked with symbols. They stood just at the tree line, watching us with dozens of familiar faces. "So what now?" Jake asked. "We can't stay here forever." I examined the carved symbols more closely, trying to understand their purpose. They were definitely protective in nature. I could feel the same tingling sensation I'd experienced with the wooden stakes. But they were also clearly very old, worn by weather and time. "Look at this," I said, kneeling beside one of the larger symbol clusters. Several of the carved lines had been deliberately scratched out or filled with what looked like dried blood. "Someone's been vandalizing the protections." Tom joined me in examining the damaged symbols. "The creatures," he said. "It's one of the things they do. They find ways to weaken the barriers that contain them, bit by bit, year by year." "Then these protections are failing," Jake concluded. As if to confirm his words, one of the creatures, the one wearing Danny's face, stepped into the clearing. It moved cautiously, testing each step, but the symbols didn't repel it as they should have. "The barriers are definitely weakening," I said. "We need to get out of here before they collapse completely." But even as I spoke, more creatures began entering the clearing. They moved slowly, still wary of the carved symbols, but no longer completely stopped by them. "The stakes," Tom said. "Maybe we can use them to reinforce the protections." It was worth trying. We each knelt beside a different section of damaged symbols and pressed our wooden stakes against the carved lines. The moment the wood touched the stone, the symbols blazed with bright white light. The creatures in the clearing shrieked and stumbled backward, their stolen faces contorting with pain. The light spread outward from our stakes, following the carved patterns across the entire clearing floor. "It's working!" Jake shouted over the creatures' screams, but the effort was taking a toll on us as well. I could feel energy draining from my body, as if the stakes were drawing on our life force to power the renewed protections. Tom was pale and shaking, and Jake's hands were trembling where they gripped his stake. "I don't think we can maintain this for long," I warned. "We don't need long," Tom said through gritted teeth. "Just long enough." "Long enough for what?" "To get them all in one place," he said, and I saw what he was planning. The renewed barriers had forced all the creatures back to the edge of the clearing, where they clustered together in a tight group. They were trapped between the protective symbols and whatever lay deeper in the forest, perhaps more barriers we couldn't see. "When I say go," Tom said, "pull your stakes and run for that gap between the two big oak trees. There's a path there that leads back toward the main trail." "What about you?" Jake asked. "I'll be right behind you," Tom promised, but something in his voice suggested otherwise. The creatures were testing the renewed barriers, probing for weaknesses. I could see cracks beginning to form in the blazing symbols, and my strength was fading fast. "Now!" Tom shouted. Jake and I pulled our stakes free and ran for the gap Tom had indicated. Behind us, the protective light began to fade immediately, and the creatures rushed forward with renewed fury. I expected to hear Tom's footsteps behind us, but when I glanced back, he was still kneeling in the center of the clearing. His stake was pressed against the altar stone, and white light was pouring from the carved symbols with blinding intensity. "Tom!" I screamed, turning back toward him. "Keep running!" he shouted back. "I can hold them for a few more seconds, but then you're on your own." The creatures were almost upon him, their elongated limbs reaching out like grasping spiders. But the light from the altar was so bright now that they couldn't get close. They circled him like moths around a flame, unable to approach but unwilling to retreat. Jake grabbed my arm and dragged me toward the tree line. "He's buying us time," he said. "Don't waste it." We plunged into the forest beyond the clearing, following what might have been a trail or might have been wishful thinking. Behind us, Tom's voice rose in what sounded like a war cry, and the light from the clearing flared even brighter. Then, suddenly, everything went dark and quiet. We ran for what felt like hours, crashing through underbrush and scrambling over fallen logs. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like rubber, but the memory of those creatures kept me moving. Eventually, we stumbled onto a familiar-looking dirt path marked with carved symbols on nearby trees. The old woman's protected trail, leading back toward her cabin. "We made it," Jake gasped, collapsing against one of the marked trees. But I couldn't celebrate yet. What about Tom? We listened for any sounds of pursuit, but the forest was completely silent. No creatures, no screaming, no sounds of Tom following behind us. "Maybe he got away," Jake said, but he didn't sound convinced. We waited for nearly an hour, hoping Tom would emerge from the forest behind us. But as the sun began to set and shadows started lengthening between the trees, we realized he wasn't coming. "We have to go back," I said. "No," Jake replied firmly. "Tom knew what he was doing. He made a choice to give us time to escape. If we go back now, we're just throwing away the sacrifice he made." I knew he was right, but abandoning Tom felt like the worst kind of betrayal. Still, darkness was coming, and we both remembered what the old woman had said about the creatures being strongest at night. We made our way back along the trail as quickly as our exhausted bodies would allow. The old woman's cabin appeared just as the last light was fading from the sky, smoke still rising from its chimney and warm light glowing in its windows. She was waiting for us on her front porch, rocking slowly in an ancient wooden chair. "2 of you came back," she observed. "Where's the third?" I explained what had happened in the clearing, how Tom had stayed behind to hold off the creatures while Jake and I escaped. She listened without interruption, her weathered face unreadable in the lamplight. "He did the right thing," she said finally. "Those protections were failing, have been for years. Someone needed to renew them properly, and that requires a willing sacrifice." "Sacrifice?" The word hit me like a physical blow. "You mean he's dead?" "Not dead," she said carefully, "but changed. The barriers needed life force to power them, and your friend gave his willingly. He's part of the protections now, part of what keeps those things contained." She gestured toward the dark forest. "He'll watch over these woods for the rest of his existence, making sure the creatures can't spread beyond their ancient boundaries." I thought about Tom's horrible smile when the creature had been wearing his face, and wondered if this fate was really any better. But the old woman seemed to read my thoughts. "It's not the same as being possessed," she assured me. "He chose this. His consciousness, his soul. They're intact. He's just bound to this place now. Guardian instead of prisoner." Over the next few days, she helped us recover our strength and arranged for us to be picked up by a ranger who owed her family old favors. We never did find my car. The old woman suggested it had probably been relocated to somewhere more convenient. And sure enough, we found it parked at a truck stop 3 towns over with no explanation. Jake and I never talked about what happened in those woods. We agreed that no one would believe us, and more importantly, we weren't sure we wanted anyone to know about the creatures or the old woman or the protections that kept them contained. But sometimes, on clear nights when the moon is full, I think I can hear Tom's voice carried on the wind. Not the horrible, broken record laughter of the creature that possessed him, but his real voice, calling out across the wilderness, warning other travelers to stay on marked paths, to respect the old protections, to remember that some places are meant to remain wild and untouched. I hope he's found peace in his new role as guardian of those ancient woods. I hope the sacrifice he made was worth it. And I hope that the protections he's helping to maintain will hold for another generation, keeping the creatures contained until someone else can take up the watch. But I also hope I never have to find out for certain. Because despite everything we survived, despite the old woman's assurances about Tom's willing sacrifice, I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear that horrible broken record laughter echoing from some dark corner of my memory. And when that happens, I remind myself that there are places in this world where ancient things still dwell, places where the old rules still apply, and places where the price of curiosity might be higher than anyone should be willing to pay. The creatures are still out there, somewhere in the deep woods of Maine. Tom is still out there too, standing guard between them and the world we know. And sometimes, that's the only thing that lets me fall back asleep. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Baxter State Park, Maine, near the shadow of Mount Katahdin, in October of last year. The autumn air bit at my cheeks as I adjusted my backpack straps, the weight of 3 days' worth of supplies cutting into my shoulders. My boyfriend Marcus had convinced me that this trip would be therapeutic, a chance to disconnect from the world and reconnect with each other after months of arguing about everything from his drinking to my controlling nature, as he put it. The irony wasn't lost on me that we'd driven 6 hours north to the most isolated part of Maine to work on our relationship. "You sure about this trail?" Marcus asked, squinting at the weathered wooden sign that read Wasataquoik Stream Trail, 8 miles to remote camping area. His breath formed small clouds in the crisp October air. "Looks like nobody's been down here in months. That should have been our first warning." The trail markers were faded, some completely illegible, and the path itself seemed to disappear and reappear like a half-remembered dream. But I was determined to make this work. The trip, our relationship, everything. "It'll be beautiful," I said, forcing optimism into my voice. "Look at those pines. They're massive." The trees were indeed massive. Ancient white pines that stretched impossibly high, their canopy so thick it blocked out most of the afternoon sun. As we walked deeper into the forest, the familiar sounds of civilization faded away. No distant highway hum, no airplane engines, not even the sound of other hikers. Just our footsteps on the carpet of brown needles and the occasional crack of a branch somewhere in the shadows. The first hour passed pleasantly enough. Marcus seemed almost cheerful, pointing out interesting rock formations and making jokes about my overpacked first aid kit. We even held hands for a while, something we hadn't done in months. Maybe this would work after all. But as the afternoon wore on, something began to feel wrong. The trail, which should have been clearly marked according to the park map, kept branching off in directions that weren't indicated on any of our charts. More unsettling. The GPS on my phone showed us walking in circles, even though we'd been heading steadily northeast for hours. "This can't be right," I muttered, stopping to check the device again. The blue dot representing our position seemed to flicker and jump around the screen like a confused fly. Marcus looked over my shoulder, his breath warm against my neck. "When's the last time you updated that thing? GPS is probably just glitchy out here." "I updated it yesterday." But even as I said it, doubt crept in. The phone showed full bars, which seemed impossible this deep in the wilderness, and the time, according to the screen, it was 6:47 p.m., but the light filtering through the pines suggested it was barely past 4. We pressed on, following what appeared to be the main trail. The forest around us grew denser, the pines giving way to twisted oaks and birches whose bare branches created a maze of shadows. The temperature seemed to drop with each step, and I found myself pulling my jacket tighter around my shoulders. "There," Marcus said suddenly, pointing ahead. "Looks like a clearing." The campsite, when we finally reached it, was not at all what I'd expected. Instead of the maintained area shown in the park brochures, we found a rough circle of bare earth surrounded by those impossibly tall pines. In the center sat a fire ring made of blackened stones, and nearby, someone had built a crude wooden table from fallen logs. Everything was covered in a thin layer of pine needles, as if it hadn't been used in years. "Well, it's rustic," Marcus said, dropping his pack with obvious relief. As we set up camp, the wrongness I'd been feeling all day intensified. The silence was too complete. No bird songs, no insect buzzing, not even wind through the trees. When I mentioned this to Marcus, he just shrugged. "It's October, Jen. Everything's probably hibernating or migrated south." But I knew forests. I'd been camping since I was a child, and I'd never experienced such absolute quiet. Even in winter, there were sounds. Wind, settling snow, the crack of freezing wood. This was different. This was the silence of a held breath. We managed to get a fire going as darkness fell, though the flames behaved strangely. Instead of the steady orange glow I expected, they flickered between colors, sometimes blue-white, sometimes an unsettling green. When I pointed this out to Marcus, he insisted it was just the type of wood we were burning. "Different trees burn different colors," he said, poking at the logs with a stick. "Copper in the bark or something." As we sat by the fire eating our freeze-dried dinner, I noticed Marcus kept glancing over his shoulder at the tree line. When I asked him about it, he claimed he hadn't been doing anything, but I caught him at it again and again. Quick, nervous looks into the darkness beyond our small circle of light. "What are you looking for?" I finally asked. "Nothing. Just, don't you feel like we're being watched?" The question sent ice water through my veins because, yes, I did feel exactly that. The sensation had been growing stronger all evening, a prickling awareness of unseen eyes studying our every move. But admitting it would make it real, and I wasn't ready for that yet. "It's just the isolation getting to you," I said, more to convince myself than him. First night camping jitters. We went to bed early, zipping ourselves into our respective sleeping bags inside the small two-person tent. Marcus fell asleep almost immediately. I could hear his breathing deepen and slow, but I lay awake staring at the tent ceiling. The silence outside was so complete it felt oppressive, like a weight pressing down on us. That's when I heard the whispering. At first, I thought it might be wind through the pines, but the sound was too rhythmic, too much like human voices speaking just below the threshold of understanding. The whispers seemed to circle our tent, sometimes close enough that I was sure I could make out individual words, but never quite clear enough to understand what was being said. I reached over to shake Marcus awake, but my hand encountered empty sleeping bag. The zipper was open from the inside, the fabric still warm but clearly vacant. "Marcus," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. No response. I fumbled for my flashlight and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness of the tent. Marcus's sleeping bag lay open and empty, his boots gone from beside the tent flap. I unzipped the tent entrance and peered out into the night. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting just enough light to see that the campsite was empty. No sign of Marcus anywhere. "Marcus!" I called, louder this time. My voice seemed to be swallowed by the darkness before it could travel more than a few feet. I grabbed my boots and jacket and stumbled out of the tent, shining my flashlight in all directions. The beam seemed weaker than it should have been, as if the darkness itself was absorbing the light. "Marcus, where are you? This isn't funny." The whispering grew louder, more insistent. Now I was sure I could hear words. My name, repeated over and over in voices that sounded almost like Marcus, but not quite right. The pitch was wrong, the inflection strange, as if someone were trying to imitate his voice without quite understanding how it should sound. I followed the sound deeper into the forest, my flashlight beam dancing wildly as I stumbled over roots and fallen branches. The pine needles beneath my feet were slick with moisture, and more than once I nearly fell. "Jennifer!" The whisper came from directly behind me. I spun around, heart hammering, and there he was. Marcus stood just at the edge of my flashlight beam, perfectly still among the trees. Relief flooded through me. Thank God. "Marcus, what are you doing out here? You scared me to death." But as I moved closer, the relief curdled into something else. Marcus wasn't moving. Not at all. He stood perfectly straight, arms at his sides, staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. His eyes reflected the flashlight beam like an animal's, and his mouth hung slightly open. "Marcus, are you okay?" He smiled then, but it was all wrong. Too wide, showing too many teeth, lasting far too long. When he finally spoke, his voice had that same strange inflection I'd heard in the whispers. "Jennifer, you came looking for me." "Of course I did. What are you doing out here? It's the middle of the night." "I was gathering wood," he said, though I could see no wood anywhere near him. "For the fire. To keep you warm." Something in his tone made my skin crawl. I'd known Marcus for 3 years, lived with him for 1, and I'd never heard him speak like that. Formal, careful, as if he were reciting lines from a script. "Okay, well, let's go back to camp then. It's freezing out here." "Yes," he said, that unsettling smile never wavering. "Let's go back to camp." But he didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me with those reflective eyes, smiling that horrible smile. "Marcus, come on. What's wrong with you?" "Nothing is wrong," he said. "Everything is exactly as it should be." I took a step backward, and finally, he moved. Not toward the campsite, but toward me. His gait was wrong, too stiff, like someone learning to walk for the first time. "Jennifer," he said, and his voice was layered now, as if multiple people were speaking in unison. "Don't you want to stay? Don't you want to be with me forever?" I ran. I crashed through the forest, branches tearing at my clothes and face, my flashlight beam swinging wildly as I tried to find my way back to camp. Behind me, I could hear Marcus following, or whatever was wearing Marcus's face, its footsteps unnaturally quiet despite the rough terrain. When I finally burst into the clearing, I made straight for the tent, planning to grab our packs and get out of there. But when I unzipped the tent flap, I found Marcus inside, curled up in his sleeping bag, apparently fast asleep. I stood frozen, flashlight trained on his peaceful face. He looked completely normal. No strange smile, no reflective eyes, just Marcus sleeping soundly as if nothing had happened. "Marcus?" I whispered. His eyes opened immediately, focusing on me with perfect clarity. "Jen, what are you doing? Why are you dressed?" You were outside, in the forest. I followed you." He sat up, genuinely confused. "I've been asleep. I haven't been anywhere." He glanced at his watch. "It's 2 a.m. What's going on?" I stared at him, searching his face for any sign of the thing I'd encountered in the woods. But this was definitely Marcus. I could tell by the way he rubbed his eyes when he was tired, the little scar on his chin from a childhood accident, the exact tone of concern in his voice. I must have been dreaming," I said finally, though I knew it wasn't true. The scratches on my arms from running through the forest were real enough. "Must have been some dream," he said, reaching out to touch one of the cuts on my cheek. "You're bleeding." I settled back into my sleeping bag, but I didn't sleep. I lay there listening to Marcus's breathing, trying to convince myself that whatever I'd experienced had been some kind of waking nightmare brought on by stress and isolation. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that smile. Those reflective eyes heard that voice that was Marcus but wasn't Marcus. Morning brought no relief. Marcus seemed perfectly normal as we broke camp, chatting about the weather and making plans for the day's hike. But I noticed things that chilled me to the bone. He forgot the name of my sister, someone he'd met dozens of times. He put salt in his coffee instead of sugar, something I'd never seen him do. And when I mentioned our fight about his drinking, the reason we'd come on this trip in the first place, he looked at me blankly. "What drinking problem?" he asked. By noon, I was convinced that whatever had happened in the forest, the real Marcus hadn't come back. This thing wearing his face was an imposter, and it was getting better at the imitation with each passing hour. The worst part was that it knew I knew. Sometimes I'd catch it watching me with an expression of calculating intelligence that had never existed in Marcus's face. When I tried to use my phone to call for help, it suggested we should preserve the battery for emergencies. When I mentioned cutting the trip short, it reminded me how much we'd spent on permits and supplies. Besides, it said with that too-wide smile, we're having such a wonderful time together. We were supposed to hike out the next morning, following the same trail we'd taken in, but the path that had seemed so clear just 2 days earlier was gone. Where there had been marked trail, we found only dense forest. The GPS on my phone spun wildly, unable to get a fix on our location. We must have taken a wrong turn, the thing that looked like Marcus said. We should go back and try again. But when we retraced our steps, we found ourselves in the same clearing we'd started from, as if the forest itself was conspiring to keep us trapped. That's when I knew for certain that whatever had taken Marcus's place wasn't human, and it had no intention of letting me leave. The second night was worse. I pretended to sleep while monitoring the Marcus thing from the corner of my eye. Around midnight, it unzipped its sleeping bag and crept out of the tent with that unnaturally quiet step. Through the tent wall, I could see its silhouette moving around the campsite, but it wasn't doing anything I could identify, just standing in different spots, as if following some invisible pattern. When it returned an hour later, I felt it settle into its sleeping bag and heard what sounded like Marcus's normal breathing. But underneath that sound was something else, a low humming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The next morning, our supplies had changed. The food we'd carefully packed and rationed was different. Brands I'd never bought, flavors Marcus hated. When I mentioned this, it looked at me with that calculating expression. "You must be mistaken," it said. "Memory can be unreliable under stress." That afternoon, while the Marcus thing dozed by the fire, I tried to make a run for it. I grabbed my pack and headed into the forest, moving as quietly as possible. But no matter which direction I went, I always ended up back at the clearing. The trees seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, rearranging themselves to funnel me back to the campsite. When I emerged from the tree line for the 4th time, the Marcus thing was waiting for me, sitting by the fire with that horrible smile. "Going somewhere?" it asked. I was just exploring. "Of course you were. But Jennifer, don't you think it's dangerous to wander off alone? What if something happened to you? What if you got lost?" The way it said "lost" made my blood freeze. There was anticipation in its voice, as if the idea of me being lost was something it found appealing. That night, I made my decision. Whatever this thing was, whatever it had done with the real Marcus, I couldn't let it continue wearing his face. I waited until I was sure it was asleep, then crept out of the tent with a hatchet from our camping supplies. But as I raised the blade above the sleeping figure, its eyes snapped open. They reflected the moonlight like mirrors, and when it smiled, I saw that its teeth had changed. Longer now, sharper, definitely not human. "Did you really think it would be that easy?" it asked in that layered voice I'd heard in the forest. I swung the hatchet down, but my hands passed through empty air. The sleeping bag was vacant. The zipper opened from the inside, just like that first night. "Jennifer." The voice came from behind me. I spun around to find the Marcus thing standing at the edge of the clearing, no longer bothering to maintain the pretense of humanity. Its limbs were too long now, its fingers ending in dark points. Its face was still recognizably Marcus's, but stretched and distorted like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. "You've been such wonderful company," it said, taking a step closer. "But I think our camping trip needs to end now." I ran again, crashing through the forest with no thought of direction, just a desperate need to put distance between myself and that thing. Branches whipped at my face and roots tried to trip me, but I kept running, the hatchet clutched in my white-knuckled grip. Behind me, I could hear it following, not running, just walking at that impossibly quiet pace as if it knew exactly where I would end up. I burst through a wall of pine boughs and found myself standing on the edge of a cliff I was certain hadn't been there before. Below stretched a valley filled with mist, and in that mist I could see lights. Not electric lights, but something older, colder. "Beautiful view, isn't it?" The voice came from directly behind me. I spun around to find the Marcus thing barely 3 feet away, close enough that I could smell its breath, like decay and wet earth. "What are you?" I whispered. "I'm Marcus," it said, and laughed with a sound like breaking glass. "I'm your boyfriend who loves you very much. Don't you remember our wonderful camping trip?" "Where is he? Where's the real Marcus?" Its smile widened impossibly. "He's right here. Can't you see him?" For just a moment, I did see him, the real Marcus, trapped somewhere behind those terrible eyes, screaming silently for help. Then the vision was gone, and there was only the thing wearing his face. "He wanted to gather wood," it said conversationally, "for the fire, to keep you warm. But he found something else instead. Something hungry. Something that had been waiting in these woods for a very long time." I raised the hatchet, and this time I didn't hesitate. The blade bit deep into the thing's shoulder, black liquid spurting from the wound. It shrieked, a sound no human throat could make, and stumbled backward. "You can't kill me," it gasped, the Marcus mask beginning to slip. "I'm part of this place now, part of the forest, part of the whispers." But it was wrong. The wound I'd inflicted was spreading, cracks of light appearing across its stolen skin. The forest around us began to shudder and blur, as if it too was just another mask waiting to be torn away. "What have you done?" it screamed, but its voice was fading, becoming just another whisper in the wind. The last thing I remember clearly is the ground rushing up to meet me as the cliff crumbled away. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital in Millinocket, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. The park rangers who found me said I'd been discovered on a popular hiking trail, barely a mile from the main road. I was severely dehydrated and suffering from exposure, but otherwise unharmed. They never found Marcus. The official report lists him as missing, presumed dead due to a hiking accident. The search team scoured hundreds of square miles but found no trace of him. No body, no belongings, nothing. It was as if he'd simply vanished from the face of the earth. I tried to tell them about the thing in the forest, about the Marcus imposter and the clearing that moved itself around. But trauma and exposure can play tricks on the mind, they said. I'd been through a terrible ordeal, and it was natural for my memory to be unreliable. Sometimes I almost believed them. Almost convinced myself that Marcus really did fall into a ravine or get lost in the vast wilderness of northern Maine. That everything else was just my mind trying to process the trauma of losing someone I loved. But then I remember his smile in the darkness, those reflective eyes, the way he'd forgotten my sister's name. I moved away from Maine after that, as far south as I could manage. I don't go camping anymore, don't even like being in forests during the day, because sometimes, when the wind is just right and the trees are whispering to each other, I hear that voice again. "Jennifer," it calls from the shadows between the leaves, "don't you want to go camping? Don't you want to be together forever?" And I know that somewhere in the deep woods of Baxter State Park, something is still wearing Marcus's face, still gathering wood for a fire that will never die, still waiting for the next group of hikers to stumble into its clearing. The rangers have assured me that the area where I was found is perfectly safe, that thousands of people hike those trails every year without incident. But I've done my research, and I found the reports they don't like to talk about. The missing persons cases that never get solved, the hikers who vanish without a trace, the occasional survivor found days later with gaps in their memory and stories that don't quite make sense. They all mention the same thing: the unnatural silence of the deep forest, the way the trails seem to move when you're not looking, and the whispers that call your name in voices that sound almost like someone you love. If you're planning to go camping in northern Maine, please be careful. Stay on the marked trails, don't travel alone, and if you hear whispers in the wind that sound like familiar voices, don't follow them into the forest. And if someone you're with goes to gather wood in the middle of the night and comes back acting just a little bit different, if they smile too wide or forget things they should remember, don't trust them. Run. Because some things in the wilderness are older and hungrier than we can imagine, and they've learned that the best way to catch their prey is to wear a face we love. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness surrounding Moosehead Lake in northern Maine, near the town of Greenville, during what was supposed to be a 3-day camping trip with my 2 closest friends from college. I should have known something was wrong when the locals at the general store in Greenville kept exchanging glances when we mentioned our destination. The elderly clerk, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he bagged our supplies, had muttered something about staying on the marked trails and not venturing out after dark. At the time, I dismissed it as typical small-town superstition designed to spook city folk like us. David Jones, my college roommate and eternal optimist, had laughed it off entirely. "Come on, Mike, it's 2024. What's the worst that could happen? Bears?" He shouldered his oversized backpack with the confidence of someone who'd watched too many survival shows but had never actually spent a night in true wilderness. Robert Johnson, our third companion and the most practical of our group, had simply shrugged and checked his GPS one more time. Rob was an accountant by trade, methodical and cautious, the kind of person who packed 3 backup batteries for everything. If he was concerned about the clerk's warnings, he didn't show it. The drive to our chosen campsite took us deep into the North Maine woods, along increasingly narrow dirt roads that wound through dense stands of pine, spruce, and birch. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy and dappled patterns that should have been beautiful, but something about the way the shadows moved made my skin crawl. The silence between us grew heavy as we drove deeper into the wilderness, broken only by the occasional crunch of gravel under our tires and the distant call of loons across the lake. We'd chosen a remote spot on the northern shore of Moosehead Lake, accessible only by a 2-mile hike from the nearest logging road. The isolation was exactly what we'd wanted, a chance to disconnect from our increasingly digital lives and reconnect with nature. None of us could have predicted that this desire for solitude would become our greatest vulnerability. The hike to our campsite was uneventful, though I noticed Rob checking his GPS more frequently than usual. "Signal's a bit spotty," he mentioned casually, but I caught the slight frown that crossed his face when he thought we weren't looking. David, meanwhile, was in his element, pointing out various flora and fauna with the enthusiasm of a nature documentary narrator, his voice echoing strangely in the dense forest. We reached our destination just as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The campsite was perfect, a small clearing near the lake's edge, surrounded by towering pines that provided natural windbreaks. The water lapped peacefully against the rocky shore, and for a moment, all my earlier unease evaporated. This was exactly what we'd needed. Setting up camp took longer than expected. David's tent had a broken zipper that required creative problem-solving, and Rob discovered that one of his tent stakes was missing. I found myself growing increasingly irritated by these minor setbacks, though I couldn't explain why such small problems felt so ominous. The forest around us seemed to be watching, waiting. By the time we had everything set up, darkness was falling with surprising speed. The temperature dropped noticeably as the sun disappeared behind the tree line, and I found myself grateful for the warm sleeping bag I'd almost left at home. We built a fire in a ring of stones near the water's edge, the flames casting dancing shadows that made the surrounding woods seem alive with movement. "So," David said, settling back against a fallen log with a beer in his hand, "anyone know any good ghost stories?" Rob and I both told him to shut up simultaneously, which made us all laugh, but the laughter felt forced, unnatural in the oppressive silence of the wilderness. Even the normal sounds of a forest at night, the rustle of small animals, the calls of nocturnal birds, seemed muted, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. We talked for a while about work, about mutual friends, about anything except the growing sense that we were being observed. The fire burned steadily, but I noticed it took more wood than usual to maintain the flames, and the smoke seemed to twist in unnatural patterns before disappearing into the night sky. Around midnight, David announced he was turning in. Rob followed suit shortly after, leaving me alone by the dying fire. I should have gone to bed as well, but something kept me awake, a persistent feeling that sleep would leave us vulnerable to whatever lurked in the darkness beyond our small circle of light. That's when I heard it for the first time, a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't quite human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. The sound raised every hair on my body and sent ice through my veins. I sat frozen, straining to hear it again, but the forest had returned to its unnatural silence. I convinced myself it had been a loon or perhaps a coyote in the distance, but deep down I knew it was something else entirely. The next morning brought no relief from the oppressive atmosphere. If anything, things felt worse. Rob's GPS was completely dead despite having a full charge the night before, and David's usually reliable smartphone showed no signal bars whatsoever. More disturbing was the discovery that our carefully organized food supplies had been disturbed during the night. Not eaten or destroyed, just rearranged. Cans that had been stacked neatly were now scattered randomly, and a bag of trail mix had been opened and its contents spread in what almost looked like a deliberate pattern. "Must have been raccoons," David said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. We all knew raccoons didn't arrange food in geometric patterns. Rob was studying his paper map with increasing frustration. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "According to this, we should be able to see Mount Caneo from here, but I don't see it anywhere." He looked up at us with an expression I'd never seen on his methodical face before, genuine confusion mixed with the first hint of fear. We decided to spend the day exploring the immediate area, hoping to get our bearings and maybe find a spot with better cell reception. The hiking was more difficult than expected. Trails that should have been clearly marked according to our guidebook were overgrown or seemed to lead in impossible directions. Twice we found ourselves back at our campsite despite believing we'd been walking in a straight line away from it. But it was David who first voiced what we were all beginning to suspect. "Guys," he said, his voice unusually quiet as we took a break beside what should have been a familiar trail marker, "have you noticed that we haven't seen any wildlife? No squirrels, no birds, no insects even. It's like everything's gone." He was right. The forest around us was alive with vegetation but devoid of any animal sounds. Even the ever-present buzz of mosquitoes that plagued Maine summers was absent. The silence was so complete it felt oppressive, like a physical weight pressing down on us. That afternoon, things took a turn from unsettling to genuinely frightening. We returned to camp to find our fire pit filled with fresh ashes despite having carefully extinguished it that morning. More disturbing were the footprints circling our tents, bare, human footprints that were too large and elongated to belong to any of us. The prints seemed to appear and disappear randomly, as if whatever had made them moved with an unnatural gait. "We should leave," Rob said simply. For the first time since I'd known him, his usual methodical calm had cracked. "Pack up now and hike back to the truck." But when we tried to follow our own trail back to the logging road, we discovered that the path we'd taken just 2 days earlier had vanished. Not overgrown. Vanished. Where clear markers and broken branches had guided us in, we now found only pristine forest that looked as if no human had ever passed through. As panic began to set in, David suggested we head for the lake shore and follow it south toward Greenville. It was a longer route, but at least we could maintain our direction. What we found at the water's edge, however, made us question our sanity. The lake was wrong. Not just different, wrong. Where Moosehead Lake should have stretched for miles in either direction, we found a body of water that seemed to curve impossibly, forming shapes that hurt to look at directly. The far shore appeared both infinitely distant and uncomfortably close, shifting like a mirage whenever we tried to focus on specific landmarks. "This isn't possible," Rob whispered, his map falling from nerveless fingers. "Water doesn't. It can't." That night, we decided to take watches. The oppressive wrongness of our situation had us all on edge, and none of us wanted to be caught sleeping if whatever was playing with us decided to make a more direct appearance. I volunteered for the first watch, from sunset until midnight. The fire seemed reluctant to catch despite our having plenty of dry wood. When it finally did light, the flames burned an odd blue-green color that cast sickly shadows on the surrounding trees. I fed it constantly, terrified of what might emerge from the darkness if our small circle of light disappeared. Around 10 p.m., I heard footsteps circling our camp. Not the soft pad of animal paws, but the deliberate placement of bare human feet on forest floor. The steps came from just beyond the reach of our firelight, pacing in a slow, patient circle that never varied in rhythm or distance. I called out challenges, but received no response except the continuation of that methodical pacing. When David took over the watch at midnight, I tried to sleep but found it impossible. Through the thin walls of my tent, I could hear him muttering prayers under his breath, something I'd never known him to do despite his Catholic upbringing. The footsteps continued their circuit, sometimes joined by what sounded like whispered conversations in a language I didn't recognize. Rob's scream woke me from a fitful doze just before dawn. I scrambled from my tent to find him standing by the remains of our fire, staring at something in the woods with an expression of absolute terror. David emerged from his tent a moment later, and we both followed Rob's gaze into the trees. Standing just at the edge of the clearing was a figure that might once have been human. It was impossibly tall and thin, its elongated limbs hanging at unnatural angles. Its skin was the color of old parchment, stretched tight over bones that seemed too long for any earthly anatomy. But it was the face that made my bladder nearly release and my heart hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird. The thing had David's face. Not similar to David's face. It was David's face, perfect in every detail except for the eyes, which were solid black and reflected our firelight like an animal's. It stood motionless, watching us with David's features arranged in an expression of hungry anticipation that belonged on no human face. "That's not me," David whispered beside me, his voice barely audible. "That's not me, right? Tell me, that's not me." The creature tilted its head at an impossible angle, maintaining its unblinking stare. When it smiled, it used David's own boyish grin, but the teeth behind those familiar lips were too numerous and too sharp, filing the mouth like broken glass. Without warning, it spoke in David's voice. "Why don't you come closer, friends? I have so much to show you." We ran. We crashed through the underbrush without regard for direction or safety, driven by a primal terror that overrode all rational thought. Behind us, we could hear laughter. David's laughter, but wrong somehow, too high and lasting too long. The sound followed us through the trees, seeming to come from all directions at once. When we finally stopped, gasping and bleeding from a dozen scratches, we found ourselves in a part of the forest that felt different from anywhere we'd been before. The trees here were older, more gnarled, and they grew in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, forming natural corridors that led deeper into the woods. Moss hung from every branch like funeral shrouds, and the air itself felt thick and difficult to breathe. "What was that thing?" Rob asked. his accountant's need for logical explanations warring with the evidence of his own eyes. I didn't have an answer. In college, I'd taken a course on Native American folklore, and something about the creature nagged at my memory, but the specifics remained frustratingly elusive. All I knew was that we needed to keep moving. We walked for hours through that alien forest, following game trails that seemed to shift when we weren't looking directly at them. The sun, when we could see it through the canopy, appeared to move in ways that defied astronomy, sometimes reversing direction or standing still for impossibly long periods. It was David who first noticed we were being followed. "Guys," he said, his voice tight with renewed fear, "look at the ground behind us." Where we had passed, our footprints were being filled by others, the same elongated bear prints we'd found circling our campsite. But these weren't old tracks. They were appearing as we watched, filling our steps one by one in a deliberate procession. We began to run again, but this time the forest itself seemed to be hurting us. Fallen logs appeared across our path where none had been moments before. Branches reached out to snag clothing and tear skin. The very ground seemed to shift and buckle beneath our feet, guiding us toward some unknown destination despite our efforts to choose our own direction. Eventually, we found ourselves in a circular clearing dominated by a single, massive pine tree that had to be centuries old. Its trunk was easily 15 feet in diameter, and its branches reached so high they disappeared into the canopy above. But it was what hung from those branches that made us all stop in horror. Suspended from ropes of twisted bark were dozens of objects that looked like clothes at first glance. Only when we got closer did we realize they were skins. Human skins, dried and preserved, swaying gently in a breeze that didn't seem to affect anything else in the clearing. Some were obviously old, darkened with age, but others looked disturbingly fresh. "Oh God," Rob whispered. "Oh God, oh God, oh God." At the base of the tree, arranged in neat piles, were personal belongings: backpacks, hiking boots, cameras, cell phones. A museum of the disappeared, organized with disturbing care. I recognized some of the brands, the styles. These weren't ancient artifacts. Some of this gear couldn't be more than a few years old. That's when I remembered my folklore class. The professor had mentioned something called a Wendigo, a creature from Algonquian legend that was once human, but had been transformed by cannibalism and isolation into something else entirely. Something that could mimic human appearance and voice, that grew taller and thinner with each person it consumed, that collected trophies from its victims. But knowing what we faced didn't make our situation any less hopeless. We were lost in a wilderness that seemed to follow its own rules, hunted by something that could wear our faces and speak with our voices. Our supplies were back at a campsite we could no longer find, and the very forest seemed to be working against us. As if summoned by my thoughts, the Wendigo appeared at the edge of the clearing. It still wore David's face, but its body had grown even more distorted since our last encounter. Its limbs stretched like taffy, and when it moved, it did so with a fluid grace that no human skeleton could achieve. "You can't leave," it said in David's voice, but the words came from several directions at once, as if multiple versions of it were speaking in unison. "You belong here now. With me. Forever." David himself had gone completely still beside me, staring at his own face on that impossible body. "It's wearing me," he whispered. "It's wearing my face like a mask." The Wendigo began to circle the clearing, moving with that same patient pace we'd heard during the night watches. As it walked, it spoke in a continuous stream of voices. Some we recognized as our own, others belonging to strangers. All of them pleaded for help, for rescue, for release from whatever hell they'd found themselves trapped in. "We have company here," it said in Rob's measured tones. "So many friends who thought they could leave. But the forest keeps us all. The forest loves us." I realized then that we were looking at our own future. We would die here, in this clearing, and our skins would join the others hanging from the ancient pine. Our voices would become part of the Wendigo's collection, used to lure other unsuspecting victims into the woods. But I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. "Rob," I whispered, "your pocket knife, do you still have it?" He nodded silently, his hand moving to his belt. "When I give the signal, run for the tree. Start cutting down those things. Maybe if we destroy them, we can free whatever's left of the people it's taken." It was a desperate plan based on nothing more than hope and half-remembered folklore, but it was all we had. The Wendigo continued its circuit, speaking in a dozen different voices about the peace of surrendering, the joy of joining its collection. "Now!" I shouted. Rob sprinted for the tree while David and I tried to draw the creature's attention. It moved faster than should have been possible, its elongated limbs carrying it across the clearing in bounding leaps that reminded me sickeningly of a spider. I grabbed a fallen branch and swung it like a club, feeling it connect with something that felt like twisted wood and cold meat. The Wendigo shrieked, not with David's voice this time, but with a sound like wind through a graveyard. It stumbled backward, giving Rob precious seconds to saw through the first of the bark ropes. As the first skin fell to the ground, the Wendigo's scream intensified. Its David mask began to slip, revealing something underneath that my mind refused to process. David himself cried out as if in physical pain, clutching his head and falling to his knees. "Keep going," I yelled to Rob, swinging my makeshift weapon again. This time, the Wendigo caught it, its fingers sinking into the wood like it was soft clay. With casual strength, it snapped the branch in half and backhanded me across the clearing. I hit the ground hard, tasting blood and feeling at least one rib crack. Through blurred vision, I watched Rob continue his work, cutting down skin after skin while the Wendigo writhed in apparent agony. With each trophy that fell, the creature seemed to diminish slightly, its impossible height decreasing by inches. But it was learning to adapt. Instead of trying to stop Rob directly, it turned its attention to David, who was still kneeling and screaming. The Wendigo placed one elongated hand on David's shoulder, and immediately his cries changed to something else, a hungry moaning that made my blood run cold. "David!" I shouted, struggling to my feet despite the fire in my ribs. "Fight it!" But when David looked up at me, his eyes were solid black. "It's too late for him," the Wendigo said, this time using David's real voice instead of its mimicry. "He's part of us now, part of the collection. Soon you'll understand." David, or the thing that had been David, rose to his feet with the same fluid grace the Wendigo displayed. His movements were wrong, his joints bending in ways that made me nauseous to watch. When he smiled, I saw the same too numerous teeth that had filled the Wendigo's mouth. "Mike," he said in his own voice, "you should stop fighting. It doesn't hurt once you give in. It's actually quite peaceful." Behind them, Rob had managed to cut down nearly half of the hanging skins. The Wendigo was noticeably smaller now, though still impossibly tall and thin. More importantly, it seemed weaker, its movements less fluid and controlled. I had one chance. Ignoring the agony in my chest, I charged at the base of the tree where Rob was working. Not to help him cut the ropes, but to do something more direct. I slammed my shoulder into the ancient trunk with all the force I could muster. Nothing happened. I tried again and again, feeling more ribs crack with each impact. The Wendigo and David thing were advancing on Rob now, their movements synchronized in a way that spoke of shared consciousness. Rob had his knife out defensively, but I knew it wouldn't be enough against two of them. On my fourth attempt, I felt something give. Not the tree. It was far too massive and ancient to be brought down by one desperate man. But something else. Something that had been holding the tree in place despite the laws of physics and biology that should have governed even this nightmare forest. The ground beneath the pine began to crack and shift. The hanging skins swayed more violently, and the Wendigo stumbled, its connection to whatever power sustained it clearly disrupted. David's black eyes flickered, and for a moment I saw my friend's real face underneath, terrified, pleading, aware. "Now, Rob!" I screamed, "and all of them. Cut them all down now." Rob understood. He began slashing frantically at the remaining ropes, working faster than I'd ever seen him move. With each skin that fell, the crack in the ground widened, and the Wendigo's shrieks grew more desperate. The David thing lunged at Rob, but its coordination was off now, its movements clumsy and uncertain. Rob managed to dodge and continued cutting, sweat pouring down his face as he worked. When the last skin hit the ground, everything changed at once. The Wendigo collapsed as if someone had cut its strings, its impossible body folding in on itself until it was nothing more than a pile of yellowed bones and dried sinew. The David thing flickered like a bad television signal before solidifying back into my friend, who immediately began vomiting black bile onto the forest floor. The ancient pine groaned and began to topple, its supernatural anchoring finally severed. We grabbed David and ran as the massive trunk crashed to the earth behind us, taking with it centuries of accumulated evil. The forest around us shuddered and seemed to reset itself. Suddenly, we could hear birds singing, insects buzzing, the normal sounds of a healthy woodland ecosystem returning like a switch had been flipped. In the distance, I could see Mount Caneo exactly where it should be, and Rob's GPS began beeping as it regained satellite signal. We made it back to our truck in less than an hour, following trails that were now clearly marked and led exactly where they were supposed to. Our abandoned campsite was easy to find, our supplies undisturbed except by ordinary animals looking for food. David recovered quickly once we got him away from the clearing, though he claimed to remember nothing after going to bed that first night. Rob and I agreed never to speak of what had really happened, crafting a story about getting lost and David having a reaction to some bad water, but I dream about that clearing sometimes. I dream about the voices trapped in that ancient tree, finally free to move on to whatever comes after this life. I dream about the Wendigo, starving and alone in the woods until some unsuspecting camper gave it the chance to feed again. And sometimes, in the darkest part of the night, I wonder if we really destroyed it, or if we just freed it to hunt elsewhere, to find a new tree, to start a new collection. I haven't been camping since. Neither has Rob. David claims he wants to go back someday, says he feels drawn to the wilderness in ways he can't explain. We try to discourage him, but we can't watch him forever. The woods are patient. They can wait. And sometimes when the wind is just right and I'm alone in my apartment in the city, I swear I can hear David's voice calling my name from somewhere far away, calling me to come back, calling me home. I never answer. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness surrounding Mount Katahdin in Maine, in the shadow of Baxter State Park, where the ancient Penobscot spoke of creatures that should never be named. I should have listened to the warnings. Sarah and I had been planning this backpacking trip for months. 3 days in the wilderness, just the two of us, camping beneath the stars in one of Maine's most pristine areas. We'd been dating for 2 years, and I'd been carrying the engagement ring in my pack for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment to propose. The summit of Mount Katahdin seemed like destiny. Sarah Rodriguez was everything I wasn't. Spontaneous where I was methodical, fearless where I was cautious. She taught elementary school in Portland and had this infectious laugh that could light up any room. Her dark hair was always escaping from whatever ponytail or braid she'd attempted, and she had this habit of humming old folk songs when she was content. We started our hike on a Thursday morning in late September. The fall colors were at their peak, and the air carried that crisp bite that promised winter wasn't far behind. Our plan was simple: hike the Hunt Trail to Katahdin Stream Falls on day 1, set up base camp, then tackle the summit on day 2 before heading back on day 3. The first sign something was wrong came at the ranger station. "You folks sure you want to head up there this week?" Ranger Tom Beckwith asked, his weathered face creased with concern. He was maybe 60, with silver hair and the kind of deep tan that comes from decades outdoors. "We've had unusual reports lately." "What kind of reports?" Sarah asked, leaning against the counter with that casual confidence of hers. Beckwith hesitated, glancing around the empty station. Hikers hearing things. Voices calling from the woods. But when they investigate, nobody's there. Had one couple come back yesterday, swore they saw campfire smoke from an impossible location, right up on the cliff face where nobody could possibly camp. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the September air. Maybe we should— "Oh, come on, Mike," Sarah interrupted, squeezing my arm. "It's probably just echo effects or something. Right, Ranger Beckwith?" The old man's expression didn't change. "Maybe, but the Penobscot have stories about this area. Old stories. They say there are things in these woods that hunger for more than just flesh." "Stories?" Sarah said dismissively, but I noticed she'd stopped smiling. Beckwith shrugged and processed our permits. "Just be careful up there. Stay on the marked trails, and if you hear something calling your name in the dark, don't follow it." We left the station with our packs loaded and spirits high, despite the ranger's ominous words. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy of maples and birches, painting everything in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah hummed as we walked, some old Irish ballad her grandmother had taught her. The hunt trail was well maintained and clearly marked, winding through dense forest that seemed to muffle sound. After about 3 hours of steady hiking, we reached our planned campsite near Katahdin Stream Falls. The sound of rushing water was soothing, and we set up our tent on a flat area about 50 yards from the stream. "This is perfect," Sarah said, spreading her arms wide and spinning in a circle. "Just look at this place." I had to admit it was beautiful. The falls cascaded down a series of granite ledges, creating a natural amphitheater filled with the music of moving water. Towering pines surrounded our little clearing, and Mount Katahdin loomed above us like a sleeping giant. We cooked dinner over our portable stove. Nothing fancy, just dehydrated camping food, and as darkness fell, we built a small fire in the established fire ring. Sarah curled up against me, and for a while, everything felt perfect. That's when we heard the first call. "Help!" The voice drifted from somewhere in the darkness beyond our fire's glow, weak and desperate. "Please, help me." Sarah sat up straight. "Did you hear that?" I had, and every instinct told me something was wrong. The voice had sounded strange, like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Help me." There it was again, definitely human, definitely in distress. Sarah was already reaching for her flashlight. "Someone's hurt out there." I caught her wrist. "Wait, remember what the ranger said?" "Mike, that's a person. They could be injured, lost. Please, I'm so cold." The voice came again, closer now, and I could swear it was coming from directly above us, impossible as that seemed. Sarah pulled free and stood up. "I'm a teacher, Mike. I can't just ignore someone who needs help." Before I could stop her, she called out into the darkness. "Where are you? We're here by the falls." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the sound of the water seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then came the laughter. It started low, barely audible, but grew in volume and pitch until it became a shrieking, inhuman sound that seemed to come from all around us. The fire flickered and dimmed, though there was no wind. Sarah grabbed my arm, her face pale in the dying firelight. "What the hell was that?" The laughter cut off abruptly, leaving only the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant sound of water over stone. My hands were shaking as I added more wood to the fire, coaxing it back to life. "Maybe we should pack up," I said. "Head back to the car." "In the dark? On an unfamiliar trail?" Sarah shook her head. "That's more dangerous than staying put." She was right, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Throughout the night, I heard sounds that didn't belong, branches snapping without wind, rustling that followed no pattern, and once, distinctly, the sound of breathing that wasn't ours. Sarah slept fitfully, mumbling in her dreams. I dozed in snatches, starting awake at every sound. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to find our fire had died completely, leaving us in absolute darkness. But that wasn't what had woken me. Someone was walking around our tent. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, circling us in a wide arc. I could hear the soft crunch of fallen leaves, the snap of twigs underfoot. My heart hammered against my ribs as I listened, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. The footsteps stopped directly beside my head, separated only by the thin nylon of our tent wall. I waited, every muscle tensed, for what felt like hours. Finally, the footsteps resumed, moving away into the forest. I didn't sleep again that night. Morning brought relief and embarrassment in equal measure. In the bright September sunlight, our terror seemed foolish. Sarah laughed off the night's events as we shared granola bars and instant coffee. "Probably just a curious bear or moose," she said, but I noticed she kept glancing toward the tree line. "I still think we should head back," I said. "Are you kidding? We came here to climb Katahdin. One spooky night isn't going to scare me off." I wanted to argue, but Sarah had already started breaking down the tent. Her determination was one of the things I loved about her, even when it worried me. We secured our base camp and started up the trail toward the summit. The morning was clear and cold, our breath visible in small puffs as we climbed. The trail was steep but well marked, switching back and forth through increasingly sparse vegetation. About 2 hours into the climb, Sarah stopped abruptly. "Mike, look at this." She was pointing at a tree just off the trail, a massive pine that had to be centuries old. Carved into its bark, about 8 feet off the ground, was a symbol I didn't recognize, a twisted spiral with lines radiating outward like a malformed sun. "That's got to be 10 feet off the ground," I said. "How did someone reach that high?" Sarah shrugged. "Ladder? Climbing gear?" But her voice lacked conviction. The symbol looked old, the bark grown over its edges as if it had been there for decades, but something about it made my skin crawl. The lines seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them. "Let's keep moving," I said. We climbed for another hour before the trail opened onto a rocky ledge that offered spectacular views of the surrounding wilderness. Sarah pulled out her camera and started taking pictures, her earlier unease forgotten in the excitement of the moment. That's when I noticed our shadows were wrong. Mine fell where it should, a dark silhouette cast by the morning sun. But Sarah's shadow was facing the wrong direction, as if cast by a light source that didn't exist. "Sarah," I called, my voice tight with fear. She looked up from her camera. "What?" I pointed at the ground. "Look at your shadow." She glanced down, and I watched her face go white. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, as if controlled by some outside force, her shadow began to move independently, raising one arm to point directly at me. Sarah stumbled backward, nearly dropping her camera. That's not possible." The shadow continued to move, now gesturing for me to come closer. Sarah looked down at her own body, confirming that she wasn't moving, that her shadow had somehow gained a life of its own. "We're leaving," I said. "Right now." This time, Sarah didn't argue. We packed up hastily and started the descent back to our base camp. But something had changed about the trail. Markers that had been clearly visible on our way up were now missing or pointing in different directions. The trail itself seemed to have shifted, branching off in directions that hadn't existed before. "This doesn't make sense," Sarah said, studying her GPS. "According to this, we're 3 miles north of where we should be." "That's impossible. We've been following the same trail." She showed me the screen. Our position was marked in an area labeled simply as uncharted on the digital map. "GPS must be malfunctioning," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. We tried backtracking, but every path we took seemed to lead us deeper into unfamiliar territory. The forest around us had changed, too. The trees were larger, older, twisted into shapes that hurt to look at. The air itself felt different, heavier, charged with a malevolent presence. As afternoon faded toward evening, we finally admitted we were lost. "We need to find shelter," Sarah said. "Set up camp for the night and figure this out in the morning." I didn't like it, but she was right. We found a small clearing surrounded by massive pines and reluctantly set up our tent again. This time, I gathered enough firewood to last the entire night. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped rapidly. Our breath formed thick clouds, and frost began to form on the tent fabric. This seemed impossible for September, even in Maine, but nothing about this trip had been normal. The fire provided some warmth and comfort, but I could feel something watching us from beyond the circle of light. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every sound made me jump. "Mike," Sarah whispered, "do you hear that?" I listened. At first, there was only the crackling of our fire and the whisper of wind through the pines. Then I heard it, a low humming sound, almost like singing, coming from somewhere in the darkness. The humming grew louder, resolving into what sounded like multiple voices joining in some ancient melody. The tune was hauntingly beautiful but wrong, somehow, as if the notes themselves were bent and twisted. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, and I was horrified to see her standing up, as if preparing to walk toward the sound. "Sarah, no!" I grabbed her arm, pulling her back down beside the fire. She blinked as if waking from a trance. What was I doing? "You were going to follow the singing." The humming stopped abruptly, replaced by that same inhuman laughter we'd heard the night before. But this time it was much closer, and I could tell it was coming from multiple sources surrounding our camp. Our fire began to dim despite the wood I'd piled on it. The flames turned from orange to blue to an sickly green color that cast everything in a hellish light. "What's happening?" Sarah whispered. The laughter grew louder, closer, and now I could see shapes moving in the darkness beyond our camp. Tall, impossibly thin figures that seemed to glide rather than walk. Their limbs were too long, jointed in places that made no anatomical sense. One of them stepped into the green firelight, and I had to bite back a scream. It had been human once, perhaps, but whatever had happened to it had stretched and twisted its form into something nightmarish. Its skin was the color of old parchment, stretched tight over protruding bones. Its face was the worst part, still recognizably human but elongated, with a mouth full of yellowed teeth that had grown too large for its skull. When it spoke, its voice was the voice we'd heard calling for help the night before. "So cold," it said, each word accompanied by a puff of frost in the frigid air. "So hungry." More of them stepped into the light. 5, 6, maybe more. It was hard to count because they never stayed still, constantly shifting and swaying like trees in a strong wind. "What do you want?" I managed to ask. The first creature tilted its head at an impossible angle. "Want?" It laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "We want what we've always wanted, what we've been denied for so long. Which is warmth," it hissed. "Life. The sweet, hot blood of those who still have souls to lose." Sarah whimpered beside me, and I could feel her trembling. I reached slowly for the knife on my belt, knowing it would be useless but needing to feel some sense of control. The creature noticed the movement and grinned wider, showing more teeth than any mouth should hold. "Oh, little rabbit," it cooed. "Your blade cannot cut what has already died, cannot kill what has been hungry for decades." "What are you?" Sarah whispered. "We are the Wendigo," the creature replied. "Born of hunger and desperation in these very woods, fed by the fear of those who venture too far from the light of civilization." I knew the legends. Wendigo, cannibalistic creatures from Native American folklore, humans who had resorted to eating human flesh and been transformed into monsters as punishment. But those were just stories. "Not stories," the creature said, and I realized I'd spoken aloud. Truth. We were hikers once, like you, lost in these woods, starving, desperate, until we made the choice that damned us all. It gestured to its companions. Thomas ate his wife when the food ran out. Mary consumed her children. I devoured my best friend while he still lived, still screamed. Sarah was crying now, quiet sobs that shook her entire body. I put my arm around her, trying to offer what comfort I could. And now, the creature continued, we hunger eternally. Never satisfied, never full, but you can end our suffering. How? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Join us, it whispered. Become as we are. Let the hunger take you and know the sweet relief of no longer fighting against nature's most primal urge. Never, I said. The creature's grin faltered. Then you will feed us instead. They rushed forward all at once, moving with inhuman speed. I grabbed a burning branch from our fire and swung it at the nearest one, but it passed right through the creature as if it were made of smoke. Sarah screamed as one of them grabbed her, its elongated fingers wrapping around her arm. I saw frost form where it touched her, and she cried out in pain. Let her go! I lunged forward, but another creature caught me, its touch like ice against my skin. Choose, the first creature hissed. Join us willingly, or watch your mate die slowly, piece by piece. I looked at Sarah, saw the terror in her eyes, and made a decision that would haunt me forever. I'll do it, I said. I'll join you. Just let her go. The creature holding Sarah released her, and she collapsed beside our dying fire. Mike, no. It's the only way, I said, though my heart was breaking. The first creature approached me, its mouth opening impossibly wide. You must feed, it whispered. Take your first taste of human flesh, and the transformation will begin. It gestured to Sarah. She will do nicely. No, I said. That wasn't the deal. There was no deal, little rabbit, only the inevitable. That's when I remembered the ring in my pack. Not the engagement ring, the iron ring my grandfather had given me, an old Irish tradition meant to ward off evil spirits. I'd carried it as a good luck charm, never believing in its supposed power. With my free hand, I managed to reach into my pocket and grasp the iron band. The moment my fingers closed around it, the creature holding me shrieked and released its grip, stumbling backward. Iron, it hissed. Cursed iron. I pulled Sarah to her feet and pressed the ring into her hand. Hold tight to this, I said. Whatever happens, don't let go. The creatures circled us warily now, no longer approaching. The iron ring seemed to create a barrier they couldn't cross. This changes nothing, the first creature snarled. The iron will not last forever. We are patient. We can wait. Maybe, I said. But we won't be here to feed you. I grabbed our essential supplies, water, first aid kit, the GPS, and took Sarah's hand. The creatures followed us as we moved, staying just outside the ring's protective influence, but they couldn't touch us. We walked through the night, following what I hoped was the correct direction back to the trailhead. The GPS was still malfunctioning, showing impossible readings, but I remembered basic navigation from my Boy Scout days. We followed the stars and hoped for the best. As dawn approached, the creatures began to fade, becoming translucent in the growing light. We will find you again, the first creature promised. Iron will not always protect you, and when next we meet, your suffering will be legendary. They vanished with the sunrise, leaving us alone in a forest that suddenly looked normal again. The trail markers reappeared, pointing the way back to civilization. We reached the ranger station by mid-morning, exhausted and traumatized, but alive. Ranger Beckwith took one look at us and asked no questions, simply radioing for medical assistance. You saw them, didn't you? He said quietly while we waited. The hungry ones. I nodded, too tired to lie. They've been in these woods for longer than anyone remembers, he said. The Penobscot know to avoid this area during certain times of the year, but tourists never listen to the old warnings. Why didn't you stop us? Sarah asked. Beckwith shrugged. Would you have listened? Really? Or would you have just gone to a different ranger station? Found someone who didn't know the stories? He was right, and we all knew it. The medical team found nothing wrong with us physically, though Sarah had frostbite on her arm where the creature had touched her. We made up a story about getting lost and spending the night in unexpected cold weather. No one questioned it. We never spoke about what really happened in those woods. Sarah broke up with me a month later, saying she needed time to process what we'd experienced. I understood, even though it broke my heart. I still carry my grandfather's iron ring, and I've never been camping since. Sometimes, on cold September nights, I hear humming outside my apartment window. When I look, there's never anyone there, but I can smell the scent of pine needles and old, hungry things. Sarah moved to California last year. She sends me a Christmas card every year with no return address, just her signature and a small drawing of an iron ring. I think she understands that some experiences bind people together in ways that can't be explained or forgotten. The engagement ring is still in my sock drawer. Sometimes I take it out and remember the moment I planned to propose, remember the happiness we felt before the darkness found us. But mostly, I try not to think about the woods at all, because somewhere in the wilderness around Mount Katahdin, they're still waiting, still hungry, still calling to travelers who venture too far from the light. And I know that someday, when the iron finally fails, they'll come for me again. I just hope when that day comes, I'll be strong enough to resist the hunger that transforms men into monsters. Because the worst part of our encounter wasn't the creatures themselves. It was the moment when joining them almost seemed like relief from the terror of being hunted. That's the real horror of the Wendigo. Not that they exist, but that given enough fear, enough desperation, enough hunger, any of us could become one of them. The woods remember everything, and some hungers never die. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the 100-mile wilderness of Maine, near the abandoned logging town of Katahdin Iron Works, where the old railway cuts through forests so thick they swallow sound itself. I should have known something was wrong when Marcus suggested we hike the old Appalachian Trail section through the barren Chairback Range. My boyfriend of 3 years had never shown interest in camping before. He was more of a craft beer and Netflix kind of guy, but after his promotion at the accounting firm, he'd become obsessed with authentic experiences and disconnecting from the digital world. The irony wasn't lost on me that a man who spent his days manipulating spreadsheets suddenly craved wilderness. "It'll be therapeutic," Marcus had insisted, his pale fingers drumming against our kitchen table as he spread out topographical maps. "Just you, me, and nature. No cell towers, no internet, no distractions." I'd agreed because I loved him, and because the mountains of western Maine held a special place in my heart. My grandfather had been a logger there in the 1960s before the operations shut down, leaving behind ghost towns and overgrown roads that nature was slowly reclaiming. He used to tell me stories about the deep woods, about places where compasses spun uselessly and men walked in circles until they starved, convinced they were heading home. We set out on a Friday morning in early October, when the maples were bleeding crimson and the birches glowed like candles against the dark spruce. Our destination was Chairback Gap, a remote camping area accessible only by a 6-mile hike through terrain that hadn't seen maintenance in decades. The trailhead sat at the end of a logging road so pitted with ruts that my Subaru scraped bottom twice. Marcus seemed different from the moment we shouldered our packs. His usual nervous chatter had been replaced by an intense focus, his dark eyes constantly scanning the tree line as if searching for something. When I asked if he was okay, he just smiled. But it was wrong somehow. Too wide and held too long. "I'm perfect, Jen. This is exactly what I needed." The trail began, innocently enough, winding through mixed hardwood forest carpeted with fallen leaves that crunched pleasantly underfoot. But after the first mile, something shifted. The path became indistinct, marked only by faded blazes on trees that seemed too far apart. The forest grew denser, pressing in from both sides until we were walking through a green tunnel that filtered the autumn sunlight into an aquatic gloom. That's when I first heard the whispers. At first, I thought it was wind through the pines, That soft susurrus that makes you strain to hear words that aren't there. But wind has rhythm, rises and falls with gusts. This was constant, just below the threshold of understanding, like voices having a conversation in the next room. "Do you hear that?" I asked Marcus during our first rest stop. He cocked his head, listening. "Hear what?" Never mind. Probably just the trees." But I caught him listening too when he thought I wasn't looking. His expression had changed, become hungry somehow, like he was waiting for something. We made good time despite the confusing trail markers. By late afternoon, we'd covered 4 miles and were approaching what the map indicated as Barren Creek. The sound of running water grew louder as we descended through a stand of ancient pines whose trunks were so massive my arms couldn't have reached halfway around them. These were old-growth trees, survivors from the logging era, and they felt different, watchful, almost sentient. The creek itself was beautiful, clear water tumbling over granite boulders worn smooth by centuries of spring floods. But something was off about the scene. The water made no sound where it should have been loudest, creating an eerie silence that made my ears ring. When I knelt to refill our water bottles, I noticed the creek bed was littered with bones. Not large ones, nothing human-sized, but small white fragments that could have been from squirrels or birds. "Weird," I muttered, trying to convince myself they were just weathered sticks. Marcus had wandered upstream while I filtered water, and when I called his name, he didn't respond. I found him standing motionless on a fallen log, staring into the forest on the far side of the creek. His shoulders were rigid, hands clenched at his sides. "Marcus." He turned slowly, and for just a moment, I didn't recognize him. His face was blank, eyes unfocused, mouth slightly open. Then he blinked and the familiar Marcus returned, complete with his sheepish grin. "Sorry, I thought I saw something. Probably just a deer." We crossed the creek on a beaver dam, our boots squelching through mud that smelled like sulfur and decay. The trail on the far side was even fainter, little more than game paths that branched and converged seemingly at random. Our GPS had been acting up since morning, showing our position jumping erratically across the map, and now it died completely with a sad electronic beep. "No problem," Marcus said, consulting the paper map. "We just follow the creek for another mile, then cut northeast to the gap." But the creek didn't behave like creeks should. It split into multiple channels, meandered through swampy areas that didn't appear on the map, and at one point seemed to flow uphill. By the time we admitted we were lost, the sun was sinking behind the ridge, painting the sky the color of old blood. We made camp in a small clearing beside what we hoped was still the main creek channel. The spot felt wrong from the moment we set foot in it. Too quiet, as if the normal sounds of evening had been muffled by an invisible blanket. Even the brook that had been babbling constantly suddenly ran silent. Marcus seemed energized by our predicament, humming under his breath as he set up our tent with unusual efficiency. I'd expected him to panic at being lost. He was normally anxious about being late for dinner reservations, let alone stranded in the wilderness. Instead, he worked with purpose, as if this had all been planned. "Beautiful spot," he said, stepping back to admire our campsite. "Very isolated." The word made my skin crawl. I busied myself hanging our food from a tree branch, following bear protocols my grandfather had drilled into me years ago. But as I worked, I became aware of being watched. Not by Marcus, who was building a fire with the focused intensity of someone performing a ritual, but by something else. Something that moved just beyond the circle of my peripheral vision. When I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. Just trees standing like silent sentinels in the gathering dusk. The fire Marcus built was wrong. The flames burned too blue, too cold, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The wood crackled and popped, but the sounds were muffled, as if we were underwater. And the smoke, instead of rising straight up on the still air, it spiraled in complex patterns that hurt to follow with your eyes. "Are you using some kind of treated wood?" I asked. Marcus looked up from poking the coals with a stick. Just deadfall. Why? The fire's burning strangely. He studied the flames for a long moment, and I could have sworn I saw satisfaction in his expression. Looks normal to me. We ate dinner in relative silence. Instant noodles that tasted like ash no matter how much salt I added. The whispering had grown louder as darkness fell, no longer content to hide behind the sound of wind. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, just below the range of understanding, like dozens of conversations happening simultaneously in a language I almost recognized. "There," I said, pointing into the trees. "Tell me you can hear that." Marcus tilted his head, listening. After a moment, he smiled. "I think it's beautiful." The words chilled me more than the October air. Marcus had many qualities, but appreciation for abstract beauty wasn't one of them. He was practical, literal-minded, the kind of person who got frustrated with poetry because it didn't say what it meant. But now, he sat listening to sounds that shouldn't exist with the expression of someone hearing their favorite symphony. "I'm tired," I announced, crawling into our tent before the conversation could continue. Inside, zipped away from whatever was whispering in the darkness, I felt marginally safer. Our sleeping bags were rated for temperatures well below freezing, and I burrowed deep into mine, trying to generate warmth through sheer will. Marcus joined me a few minutes later, sliding into his bag without his usual evening routine of checking his phone, reading, or attempting conversation. "Good night, Jen," he said softly. "Good night." But sleep wouldn't come. The whispering continued outside, sometimes seeming to circle our tent like prowling animals. Worse, I could feel Marcus lying awake beside me, his breathing too controlled, too deliberate. When I shifted position, trying to get comfortable, he would go completely still, as if listening to my every movement. Around midnight, the temperature dropped suddenly. Not gradually the way it should in autumn, but all at once, like someone had opened a freezer door. My breath began to fog inside the tent, and frost started forming on the inside of the rainfly. The sleeping bag that had been perfectly adequate became inadequate, then useless, as cold seeped up through the ground and down from the air. That's when I heard Marcus whisper something in a language I didn't recognize. I lay frozen, not from cold, but from terror, as he repeated the phrase several times. It sounded like Latin, but corrupted, vowels stretched in ways human mouths weren't meant to manage, and with each repetition, the temperature dropped further. "Marcus," I whispered. Silence. Then, "Go back to sleep, Jen." His voice was different, not the tone or pitch, but something fundamental about the way he formed words, as if he'd forgotten how his mouth was supposed to work. I didn't sleep. I lay rigid in my sleeping bag, listening to my boyfriend breathe beside me with a rhythm that was almost right but not quite, while outside, the whispering grew louder and more insistent. Sometimes it seemed to be coming from directly underneath us, as if something was buried in the ground beneath our tent. Dawn came eventually, gray and weak through the canopy. I unzipped the tent flap and crawled outside, desperate for space and light, only to find that our fire had burned all night without being tended. The flames were now entirely blue, cold enough that I couldn't feel any heat even with my hands inches from the coals. Marcus emerged a few minutes later, looking refreshed and alert in a way that seemed impossible after the night we'd had. He studied the fire with interest, poking at it with the same stick he'd used the evening before. "That's unusual," he said mildly. "We need to get out of here," I told him. "Something's wrong with this place." "What do you mean?" "The fire, the cold, the sounds. None of this is normal, Marcus. We need to break camp and hike out." He considered this, head tilted like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. "I don't think that's a good idea." "Why not? We're exactly where we need to be." The certainty in his voice made my stomach clench. Marcus was never certain about anything. He agonized over restaurant choices and spent weeks researching vacuum cleaners. But now he spoke with the confidence of someone following a predetermined plan. I started packing my gear anyway, stuffing my sleeping bag into its compression sack with shaking hands. If Marcus wouldn't leave, I'd go alone. But when I turned to fold up my half of the tent, I found him watching me with an expression I'd never seen before. His eyes were completely black, pupils dilated so wide they consumed the iris entirely. "You're not going anywhere," he said softly. I ran, crashing through the underbrush without regard for trails or direction. I fled deeper into the forest while behind me, Marcus called my name in that voice that wasn't quite his. The sound followed me for what felt like miles, never growing fainter despite the distance I was covering. The trees closed in overhead, blocking out most of the weak morning light. I stumbled over roots and through thorns that tore at my clothes and skin, driven by pure animal terror. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I kept running until I burst into another clearing and stopped short. It was our campsite. Same fire pit, same trampled grass, same blue flames dancing without heat. Our tent sat exactly where we'd pitched it, and Marcus stood beside it with his arms crossed, wearing the patient expression of someone who'd been waiting. "That was rude, Jen," he said. We're miles from—" "Distance doesn't work the way you think it does here." He gestured at the surrounding forest. "This place exists outside normal geography. Once you're here, you stay here until it's finished with you." I backed away slowly, looking for another escape route, but the trees seemed to lean inward, branches interlocking to form an impenetrable wall. The whispering had started again, louder now, and I could almost make out individual words in that strange, liquid language. "What are you?" I whispered. Marcus smiled, and his teeth were too sharp, too numerous. "I'm exactly who I've always been. I just stopped pretending otherwise." "You're not Marcus." "Of course I am. I'm the Marcus who's been planning this for months, studying maps of places where the barriers are thin, where old things can reach through. I'm the Marcus who's been listening to voices in static and learning their language. I'm the Marcus who loves you enough to share this gift." He took a step forward, and I noticed his shadow fell in the wrong direction, stretching toward the sun instead of away from it. "The entity that lives here feeds on fear and despair," he continued conversationally. "It's been trapped in this place for centuries, growing hungry, growing desperate, but it's learned that it can extend its influence through willing servants, people who invite it in, who give it permission to use their bodies, their voices, their relationships. You brought me here on purpose. I brought you here because I love you, because I want us to be together forever, in a place where nothing can separate us, where nothing changes or grows old or dies." The temperature was dropping again, frost forming on the grass despite the morning sun. My breath came in white puffs as I backed against the wall of trees, feeling bark scrape against my jacket. The real Marcus would never do this to me. His expression flickered just for a moment, and I saw something desperate and pleading in his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by that predatory hunger. The real Marcus was weak. He doubted everything, questioned every decision, lived in constant fear of making mistakes. I'm better, I'm certain. I know exactly what I want, and I'm not afraid to take it. He lunged forward with inhuman speed, but I was already moving, dodging to the side and sprinting for the tree line. This time, I didn't look for a path. I simply crashed through whatever vegetation stood in my way, branches whipping at my face and thorns catching at my clothes. Behind me, something howled. Not Marcus's voice, but something deeper, older, vibrating with harmonics that made my bones ache. The forest erupted with the sound of pursuit. Not just footsteps, but the groaning of wood, the rustle of leaves, as if the trees themselves were giving chase. I ran until my lungs felt like they were tearing, until my legs were rubbery with exhaustion, until black spots danced at the edges of my vision. But somehow I kept moving, driven by terror and the knowledge that stopping meant something worse than death. The forest began to change around me. The trees grew larger, older, their trunks twisted into shapes that suggested frozen screams. Moss hung from the branches like funeral shrouds, and the air smelled of decay and something sweet-sick that made my stomach heave. The whispering was everywhere now, no longer trying to hide, voices speaking in that liquid language that seemed to bypass my ears and go straight to my brain. Then I saw the cabin. It squatted in a clearing like a cancer, its log walls black with age and moisture. The roof had partially collapsed, and vines grew through the broken windows, but somehow it still looked inhabited. Smoke drifted from a chimney that shouldn't have been able to draw, and warm yellow light spilled from the gaps between the logs. I should have kept running. Every instinct screamed at me to avoid that place, to find another route, to keep moving no matter what. But I was exhausted, hypothermic, and desperate for shelter. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice whispered that this might be my only chance for help. The front door was made of heavy oak, carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. It opened at my touch, swinging inward on hinges that screamed like dying animals. The interior was larger than the exterior suggested, a single room dominated by a massive stone fireplace where real flames, orange and warm, danced on split logs. An old woman sat in a rocking chair beside the fire, her back to the door. She was knitting something from yarn so dark it seemed to absorb light, her needles clicking in a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. "Come in, child," she said without turning around. "You must be terribly cold." Her voice was kind, grandmotherly, everything I needed to hear in that moment. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, grateful beyond words for the warmth and apparent safety. "Thank you," I gasped. "There's something wrong with my boyfriend, and we're lost, and I know, dear." She turned then, and I saw that her face was a map of wrinkles, her eyes milky with cataracts, but her smile was warm and genuine. "You're safe now. Sit by the fire and warm yourself." I collapsed into a chair opposite her, holding my hands out to the flames. The heat felt like salvation, driving away the supernatural cold that had been gnawing at my bones. For the first time in hours, I began to relax. "My name is Agnes," the old woman said, her knitting needles never slowing. "I've lived in these woods for longer than most people can remember. I help lost travelers when I can. I'm Jennifer. My boyfriend brought me here, but something's wrong with him. He's not acting like himself." "The deep woods change people," Agnes said sadly. "Especially places like this, where the old powers still hold sway. Your young man has been touched by something that should have stayed buried. Can you help him? Can we get out of here?" Agnes's needles stopped clicking. She looked up from her knitting, and I realized her eyes weren't clouded with cataracts. They were solid white, like polished marble. "Oh, child," she said softly, "you can't leave. None of us can leave." The fire behind me guttered and died, plunging the cabin into darkness. In the sudden absence of warmth, I felt cold seeping through the floorboards, through the walls, through my skin itself. The temperature plummeted until my breath fogged and ice began forming on the windows. "Agnes," I whispered. A sound came from the darkness where she'd been sitting. Not quite laughter, not quite sobbing. Something wet and hungry that made my teeth ache. "I've been waiting so long for company," the thing that wasn't Agnes said. "So very, very long." I bolted for the door, but my hands found only smooth wall where the entrance should have been. The cabin had no door, no windows, no way out. I was trapped in a box with something that wore the shape of a kindly old woman but smelled like grave dirt and rotting meat. "Don't be afraid," it crooned. "I won't hurt you. I just want to talk, to have someone to share the long nights with. It gets so lonely here, decade after decade, with only the trees for company." I pressed myself against the wall, feeling frantically for any kind of opening. My fingers found only solid logs, fitted together so tightly that not even a knife blade could slip between them. "What are you?" I whispered. "I'm what remains when someone stays in these woods too long, when the old power gets its hooks into them and won't let go. I was a logger's wife once, back when this was a working forest. My husband went out to cut timber one morning and didn't come home. I went looking for him and got lost in places that don't appear on any map. The darkness shifted, and I caught glimpses of something that might once have been human but had been reshaped by decades of exposure to forces that predated civilization. I found him eventually, it continued, or what was left of him. The forest had claimed him, made him part of itself. He begged me to stay, to join him in the deep places where time moves differently, and I was so tired of searching, so tired of being alone. How long have you been here? Since the 1890s, by the outside world's reckoning. But time doesn't work the same way here. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, sometimes like centuries. The forest keeps us, feeds on our memories and emotions, sustains itself on human consciousness. We're batteries, in a way, providing the energy it needs to maintain its existence outside normal reality. I thought of Marcus, of the thing wearing his face and speaking with his voice. My boyfriend, is he still in there somewhere? Perhaps. The transformation isn't instant. It takes time for the old power to fully digest a human soul, but the process is irreversible. Eventually, there's nothing left but hunger and the will to serve. The darkness was absolute now, pressing against me like a living thing. I couldn't see my own hands, couldn't tell where the walls were, couldn't orient myself in any meaningful way, but I could feel the thing that had been Agnes moving around me, circling like a predator. I could make it easier for you, it offered. The transition, if you stop fighting, if you let the forest in willingly, there's less pain, less confusion. You simply fade away, and something better takes your place. No. Think about it, child. Out there in the normal world, what waits for you? A job you tolerate, relationships that disappoint, the slow decay of age and illness. Here, you could be part of something eternal, something that existed before humans walked the earth and will continue long after they're gone. I thought of my apartment in Portland, my job at the marketing firm, my sister in California who called every Sunday, my mundane, ordinary, precious life that suddenly seemed infinitely valuable. I said no. The thing sighed, a sound like wind through dead leaves. Then you'll have to learn the hard way. But don't worry, everyone breaks eventually. The forest is very patient. The cold intensified until I couldn't feel my fingers or toes. My breath came in short, painful gasps that seemed inadequate to sustain life. But somehow, in that moment of absolute despair, I remembered something my grandfather had told me years ago. Iron, I whispered. He told me stories about the old logging days, about places in the deep woods where compasses spun and men got lost for months. But he'd also told me about the ways loggers protected themselves from things that lived in the dark places between the trees. Cold iron breaks any spell. My keys. In my jacket pocket, I had a ring of keys, including the iron key to my grandfather's old house, a massive thing made from metal forged in the 1920s. My numb fingers fumbled for it, finally closing around the familiar weight. The moment the iron touched my palm, everything changed. The absolute darkness lifted slightly, revealing the cabin's interior, but not as it had appeared when I'd entered. The walls were rotten, collapsed in places, covered with fungus that glowed with sickly phosphorescence. The floor was carpeted with bones, and the thing that had pretended to be Agnes crouched in the corner, revealed in all its twisted horror. It had been human once, but decades of exposure to the forest's influence had changed it into something else. Its limbs were too long, joints bending in impossible directions. Its skin was bark rough and spotted with growths that might have been mushrooms or tumors. And its face, what remained of its face, was a map of hunger and madness that had worn away everything resembling humanity. But iron was anathema to it. The creature recoiled from my presence, hissing like a cat thrown into water. "Clever girl," it spat. "But iron won't save you forever. Not here, where the old power runs deepest." I held the key in front of me like a talisman and backed toward where I hoped the door might be. My fingers found rotting wood, then open air. The cabin's entrance hadn't disappeared. It had simply been hidden by the thing's influence. I stumbled outside into gray dawn light, still clutching the iron key. The forest looked different in daylight, less malevolent, more like normal wilderness. But I could still hear the whispering, fainter now but persistent, and I knew the danger hadn't passed. Something crashed through the underbrush behind me, and I turned to see Marcus emerge from the tree line. But this wasn't the thing that had been wearing his face at our campsite. This was actually Marcus, pale, terrified, covered in scratches but recognizably human. "Jen!" He ran toward me, relief evident in every line of his body. "Thank God you're alive. I've been looking for you all night." "Marcus?" I studied his face carefully, looking for signs of the predatory intelligence I'd seen before. "Is it really you?" "Of course it's me. What kind of question is that?" He reached for me, then stopped when he saw me flinch away. "Jen, what's wrong? Why are you looking at me like that?" "Yesterday you were different, wrong. You knew things you shouldn't have known, said things you'd never say." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "The dreams," he whispered. "I've been having these dreams where I'm someone else, doing things I'd never do. They felt so real, like I was watching myself from outside my body." "Something's been using you," I told him. "Wearing your face, speaking with your voice. It brought me here to feed me to whatever lives in these woods." Marcus looked around nervously as if expecting attack from any direction. "We need to get out of here, right now." "I don't think it's that simple. This place, it doesn't follow normal rules. I tried to run yesterday and ended up back where I started. Then we stick together and keep moving until we find a way out." He held up a small GPS device. "This started working again about an hour ago. According to this, we're only 2 miles from the logging road. It seemed too easy, too convenient. But the iron key was still warm in my palm, and Marcus felt human in a way the imposter hadn't. Maybe whatever power ruled this place was weakening with the dawn, or maybe my grandfather's iron was providing more protection than I'd realized. We hiked southeast, following a faint trail that seemed to lead in the right direction. The forest was quiet around us. No bird songs, no insect sounds, just the soft crunch of leaves underfoot and our own breathing. But it felt like normal quiet now, not the oppressive silence that had characterized our time in the deep woods. After an hour of steady walking, we crested a ridge and saw the logging road below us, exactly where the GPS indicated it should be. My car sat alone in the turnaround, covered with dew but otherwise exactly as we'd left it. "I can't believe we made it," Marcus said as we jogged down the slope. But as we approached the car, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. Fresh tire tracks in the mud beside ours, as if another vehicle had been parked there recently, and carved into the bark of a nearby tree, symbols that matched the ones on the cabin door. "Marcus," I said quietly, "we need to be very careful." The car doors were unlocked, though I distinctly remembered locking them. Our extra gear was still in the back seat, but it had been moved, rearranged. Someone, or something, had been through our belongings. I turned the key and the engine started immediately, but as we pulled onto the logging road, I caught sight of movement in the rearview mirror. A figure stood at the edge of the forest watching us leave. It was too distant to make out details, but something about its posture was familiar. "Don't look back," I told Marcus. "What?" "Whatever you do, don't turn around. Just keep looking forward until we're back on the highway." The logging road seemed longer than it had on the way in, full of turns I didn't remember and branches that scraped against the car's roof. But eventually we emerged onto Route 15, back in the world of cell phone towers and traffic signs, and I finally allowed myself to believe we'd escaped. We drove in silence for 20 miles before either of us spoke. "What really happened back there?" Marcus asked finally. I told him everything. The whispering voices, the thing wearing his face, the cabin that existed outside normal geography. He listened without interruption, his expression growing more troubled with each detail. "I remember pieces," he said when I finished, "like fragments of a nightmare. Being somewhere else, being someone else, wanting things I'd never want. It felt like drowning in someone else's thoughts. The important thing is that you fought it off. You stayed yourself." "Did I? Or are we just getting away with it this time?" He glanced at me nervously. What if it followed us? What if I'm still not entirely me? I reached over and took his hand, noting how warm and solid it felt compared to the supernatural cold of the forest. "You're you," I said firmly. "I can tell the difference." But even as I said it, I kept the iron key clenched in my other hand. We never went camping again. Marcus threw away all the gear, deleted the photos from our phones, and refused to discuss what had happened. He claimed he was moving on, putting the experience behind him, but I noticed the changes. He avoided wooded areas, even city parks. He never went anywhere alone after dark, and sometimes when he thought I wasn't looking, I'd catch him listening to something I couldn't hear. 3 months after our trip to the 100-mile wilderness, Marcus proposed. It should have been the happiest moment of my life, but something felt wrong about the timing, the location he'd chosen, a restaurant with large windows overlooking a forest preserve. "Marry me, Jen," he said, presenting a ring that caught the light strangely. "Let's be together forever." The words were right, but something in his tone made my stomach clench. That certainty was back, the confidence that had replaced his usual anxious indecision. And when he smiled, waiting for my answer, I could have sworn his shadow fell in the wrong direction. I touched the iron key I now wore on a chain around my neck, hidden beneath my shirt. It was warm against my skin, and in that warmth, I found my answer. "No," I whispered. His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, something hungry and patient that had been waiting 3 months for this moment. "I think you misunderstood the question," he said softly. I stood up from the table, backing toward the restaurant's exit while other diners watched curiously. Marcus remained seated, no longer bothering to maintain the pretense of humanity. "You can't run forever, Jen," he called after me. "I know where you live, where you work, who you care about. The forest gave me patience, but it didn't make me forget how much I love you." I ran then, out of the restaurant and into the parking lot, fumbling for my car keys with shaking hands. Behind me I could hear Marcus laughing, not the sound he'd made as a human, but something deeper and more ancient. I drive now. I've been driving for 6 hours, heading west on highways I've never traveled, staying ahead of something that wears my ex-boyfriend's face and speaks with his voice. My gas tank is getting low, and I'll have to stop soon, but I can't bring myself to slow down. The iron key is growing warm against my chest, and in the rearview mirror, I can see headlights that have been following me since I left the city. They maintain a constant distance, never getting closer but never falling behind, and I have the terrible feeling that the driver knows exactly where I'm going. The radio crackles with static between stations, and sometimes I think I can hear voices in the white noise. Familiar voices speaking in that liquid language I learned to fear in the deep woods of Maine. They're calling to me, inviting me to stop running, to accept what was always inevitable. But I keep driving, one hand on the wheel and the other clutching cold iron, racing toward a horizon that seems to retreat as quickly as I approach it. And I tell myself that as long as I keep moving, as long as the key stays cold and the voices stay trapped in static, I might still have a chance. I might still be free. But deep down, in the part of my mind that remembers the whispers in the darkness, I know the truth. The forest is patient. It can wait decades, centuries, for its servants to complete their work. And some hunts never end. They just pause between breaths, between heartbeats, between one terrified moment and the next. The headlights in my mirror flash twice, and I swear I can see Marcus smiling in the driver's seat, patient as stone, certain as death. The key around my neck is starting to burn.